It'll be more in the area of 100 or perhaps 150, 200, somewhere in there. But the Pentagon is still not giving any final figures. Judy?
All right, Jamie McIntyre at the Pentagon. Now quickly back to Aaron.
Judy, thanks. I'm just going to stay off to the side here and allow the camera to stay focused on the scene. We're keeping our eye on that gray building, and I wish I could see the monitor better. Let me just look at it. In roughly the tallest building I think you can see. Gary Tuchman, who has been down on the ground and in fact one of the few civilians into the ground zero area. Gary, can you hear me? Gary Tuchman, are you able to hear me now?
Aaron, I hear you fine. I want to tell you, an hour and 15 minutes ago, as you said, I was at ground zero with 1,000 to 2,000 rescue and recovery workers at the scene. They are all being evacuated as we speak. Most of them are now gone because of that One Liberty Plaza building, which is just to the east of the World Trade Center complex. We have talked to rescue workers who tell us they saw the building starting to twist and then said they saw some windows starting to break.
Well, we are seeing the windows breaking from where we're standing. We could see the windows falling out or facing falling out.
Okay, you have another angle, and you certainly have a better angle than me, because from our angle, and we're to the north of the building, we haven't seen the windows, so that's interesting information. I want to tell you, Aaron, that there are a lot of people who are at the site who are very frightened by that, because they had told us while we were there that they were quite worried about one or two of the buildings surrounding the World Trade Center complex. They had told us that while we were there, and now they're living through it. We can also tell you the media has been pushed back several blocks also from the perch that we were at, about 4 blocks away from the World Trade Center complex.
Gary, if you can, and if you can't, just quickly say so. Orient me here. I'm standing here looking at what was Building 7. I look to my left, to the east. The tall gray building, I believe, is One Liberty Plaza. Do I have this right?
You have it absolutely right, Aaron. The tall gray building is One Liberty Plaza. There was some confusion initially because across from One Liberty Plaza is a hotel called the Millennium Hotel. Some people thought that was the building in question. That building apparently is not in danger of collapse. It's the One Liberty Plaza, the tall gray building.
Okay, and now also, just stay with me, Gary, if you will, please. What was left of the South Tower, the World Trade Center, the South Tower was the second of those towers that was struck yesterday by the plane. What was left of it collapsed upon itself a bit ago, a while ago. Whether that impacted the One Liberty Plaza building, whether that made it more unstable or not, we just don't know.
It's hard to tell, Aaron, but as I was telling you while we were talking in our last hour, those pillars from that South Tower look very precarious. It looked like Stonehenge in Salisbury, England, the way it was standing up. It looked precarious. They were very concerned about that, so people are not surprised that happened. I also want to tell you one other thing about One Liberty Plaza. It is set up to be the triage unit, but unfortunately there's not a problem with evacuating it right now because they haven't found any survivors recently to put in the triage unit.
All right, that's One Liberty Plaza. Let's do this. Let's just keep an eye on this for a bit. Among the businesses in One Liberty Plaza, the corporate offices, the executive offices of the NASDAQ, the stock markets, Wall Street is right here in this part of town. Moneyline anchor Lou Dobbs joins us now. While there has been no trading here, there has been business going on around the world, and Lou can update us now on that. Lou?
Aaron, thank you very much. Indeed, the building you're looking at, the new headquarters of the NASDAQ, it, like the World Trade Center towers themselves, in the heart of downtown Manhattan, which is the heart of the world's financial capital. And indeed, the World Trade Towers were at the center of downtown Manhattan and creating great energy for what is the center of democratic capitalism all around the world. Now all of that, of course, has been rent by this despicable act of terrorism. We're only beginning now to learn the human toll, to learn about the property damage, the devastation, and the devastation obviously is not ended. Against this backdrop, the leaders of the financial markets, financial and corporate leaders meeting with government leaders today, joining together, trying to determine when they might be able to reopen for trading. We now know that for only the second time since the end of World War II, the stock markets will be closed not for 2, but for at least 3 days. And as yet another building threatens now to collapse in the complex, we know that the markets will be closed for a third straight session. That has not happened, by the way, since the Great Depression of 1933. Those markets, as I said, have been closed now for 2 days. They will be closed again tomorrow. Christine Romans is here now and has more for us on that part of the story. Christine?
Lou, it's an unprecedented tragedy for New York's financial district and for world markets, and a rare occurrence in financial market history as well. U.S. stock markets will be closed for 3 straight weekdays.
We are committed that the equity markets will resume operations no later than Monday. The group that gathered today will gather again tomorrow with the idea that we may well be in a position to resume trading as early as Friday.
Grim exchange officials and regulators chose the path of caution. The worry, of course, is that keeping stock markets shut will only exacerbate the nervousness and the uneasiness in the market that causes people to sell. A big sell-off is already expected when stock markets open. In the meantime, bonds and bond futures will begin trading tomorrow.
The bond market functions more appropriately and best when the stock market and the bond market are trading together, but we can certainly trade bonds without stocks for 24 to 48 hours.
Given the extent of the crisis smoldering in downtown Manhattan, economists say caution was the best path to take, but they do fear there could be panic selling when markets do open.
And I strongly urge investors to sit tight, because it will be that, simply panic selling. Nothing fundamentally has changed.
Lou, people on Wall Street clearly would like to send a signal, get stock markets trading in, show that democracy and capitalism can't, but they say the human toll and the recovery and the healing comes first.
And of course, as Aaron Brown has just been reporting, when One Liberty Plaza, one of the tallest remaining buildings and certainly one of the most important itself, is in some danger of collapse apparently as well, and there are other buildings there as well, it is all but impossible with any assurance for these leaders to put these markets open at the risk of any employee's life, of which there has already been such a devastating loss already. Christine, thank you very much. Well, the brokerage firm Morgan Stanley, some 3,500 employees resided within the World Trade Center. It was in fact the largest tenant in the World Trade Center, 3,700 employees across 20 floors. Many of those workers tonight remain unaccounted for. Peter Viles now has the story for us.
The second terrorist attack was a direct hit on the office space of Morgan Stanley. The firm had 3,500 workers in 22 floors, almost exactly in the area where the second plane hit. But incredibly, most of those employees had already fled the tower minutes before the explosion.
Miraculously, I'd say, we had 2,500 people in World Trade Center 2, 1,000 people in World Trade Center 5. It appears the vast majority got out safely.
A miracle made possible by the firm's split-second decision to evacuate the South Tower immediately after the North Tower was hit.
We have a lot of stories of courage, a lot of stories of compassion, and we're going to be fine.
You can see a very emotional Philip Purcell. No official word from Morgan Stanley on how many of its employees are unaccounted for at this hour, but we have canvassed many other firms in that complex. This is a very partial count, we must stress, but we do know at this hour that other firms in that complex are telling us that 2,700 workers in the complex remain unaccounted for, and that, we must tell you, is a very partial count. Lou?
And the toll is just unspeakable. In point of fact, about those numbers at this point, we all.
And as we see behind us right now, the damage to these structures continues.
Peter, thank you very much. Well, airports tonight remain closed throughout the country. Officials say now that they will not reopen until new security measures are put into effect. As a result of those closures, Airlines, of course, are losing millions of dollars in revenue. That is simply the latest hurdle for this industry. Airlines have watched their profits fall dramatically over the course of the past 2 years, and the economic slowdown has done nothing but accelerate that to losses. Kitty Pilgrim now takes a look at the industry.
Thanks, Lou. Well, with air traffic at a standstill, the disruption of commerce is almost incalculable. But that does not stop economists from trying to assess the damage. Now, the airline business in this country generates about $90 to $100 billion in revenues. And that's just domestic travel. That's about 4,000 planes a day. A little more than half of that business is business travel, which probably will see a drop-off in months to come. And leisure travel may also dry up, so losses work out to about $250 million a day.
I'm sure it'll be a gradual flyback. Probably on the West Coast, you'll see the flight activity come back before the East Coast. But really what I'm concerned about right now are the lingering effects of the fear of terrorism, the impact that will have on airline bookings and overall consumer confidence.
All right. Also, Midway Airlines, which has been teetering on the brink of bankruptcy, announced it will suspend operations, saying that they don't have the resources to reorganize in this environment. In terms of temporary disruption, retail sales and consumption, that's 2/3 of the economy. It's about $300 billion a month. Now, economists calculate even a 2-day disruption of shopping and purchases would add up to $15 billion. That's a 6% decline for the month. This could be seen yesterday at many malls. Many were deserted. A smattering were closed for security reasons. Now, for example, the Mall of America in Minneapolis. Lou?
Kitty, thank you very much. The cost of yesterday's deadly attack in New York City will not, of course, be known for months in all likelihood. Some experts are already calling it the most expensive man-made disaster ever. Insurance claims alone are expected to reach $15 billion. Greg Clarkin joins us now from Lower Manhattan with the details of that part of the story. Greg?
The attacks on the World Trade Center struck at the heart of Wall Street, New York's primary economic engine. But the attacks may also have a severe impact on the city's second biggest economic driver, tourism. And it's the impact on tourism that has many worried. More than 37 million people visited New York City last year, spending more than $17 billion on everything from restaurants to Broadway shows to hotels. And when job creation and other factors are figured in, it's estimated tourism has a more than $25 billion impact on New York City's economy. But the images of the attacks beamed worldwide may keep some tourists at home.
This is a clear negative blow to this economy. You know, one of the important and growing industries in New York has been tourism. And certainly this kind of heightened terrorist activity will frighten away tourists.
There are numerous other areas which could be hit hard as well. Retailers big and small are already suffering with stores closed in Lower Manhattan as the cleanup efforts continue. And some believe it may be a while before New Yorkers take to the stores.
The consumers stay home. They want to watch television. They want to watch the events unfold throughout the day, all night, as we did, as everybody across the country did. The last thing that they're thinking about is going out and buying a new shirt.
Well, in any tragedy, and this tragedy is unspeakable in its dimensions, there are unfortunately some who will try to take advantage of others. Deborah Marchini is here now and has for us the story of what is simply price gouging by some, particularly in the area of gasoline.
That's right, and particularly in the area of the Midwest. It's interesting, Lou, because the attack, of course, devastated New York and Washington, but the spike in gasoline prices and the long lines as well were mostly in the Midwest. At scattered stations in Indiana, Ohio, and Oklahoma, for example, we saw prices ranging from $2.99 all the way up to $5.19 a gallon. Now, the region's especially vulnerable to any interruptions in supplies, and consumers there know it.
It's like what I call the St. Louis snow effect. One of the things that we see in St. Louis is we have about 4 snowstorms a year. And they're typically not a big deal, doesn't disrupt traffic for very long. But if you go to your local grocery store, you'll find 10 registers running full open with customers 10 deep, all buying milk and bread. And I think American consumers have been trained to believe that if there is some impact that could involve the Middle East, you better gas up. And that's what they did all at once. And the supply system is not geared to handle that sort of surge in demand.
And the problem is demand because supplies were not affected by the attacks. The American Petroleum Institute, for example, reported today that fuel inventories rose by about 159,000 barrels. Now, major oil companies, including ExxonMobil and BP Amoco, froze prices to wholesalers. Chevron promised to exercise restraint, and Conoco wouldn't comment. Lou, the promises are really public relations. Most of the major oil companies don't own their gas stations,
right,
and so can't control what those retailers charge.
It's an extraordinary situation that anyone would take advantage here. I guess that one of the first things we should do is take our hats off to ExxonMobil and BP Amoco for having the courage to freeze those wholesale prices and exact whatever discipline they can. And I will tell you that I'm sure that we and other news organizations are committed to publicize those companies which both hold the line appropriately and with integrity, and those certainly who fail to do so.
The glare of publicity has already resulted in some service stations at least lowering the prices they jacked up yesterday.
Well, how much of this are we seeing in other industries?
We are not seeing very much of it in other industries at all. We have heard scattered complaints by consumers about car rental companies, but no real evidence that they've changed their rates at all. The same is true with hotels, with stranded travelers around the country.
What can be done here?
The interesting question is, from a legal standpoint, there isn't very much. You know, from a federal level, you have to prove that oil companies colluded or that oil gas stations colluded when they raised prices. They're no more likely to be able to prove that than that banks collude when they raised the prime lending rate. On a state level, some states have legislation in place that allows them to act. Other states just simply do not. It is not against the law to raise prices.
Okay. Well, it's against a lot of other laws. All right. Deborah, thank you. Deborah Marchini. Well, the world, of course, is struggling to address the magnitude of this tragedy and its effect on the worldwide economy. One economist today warning that a full-blown global recession is highly likely, end quote. Another said that while there's always talk that disasters have extreme consequences, they rarely do. Let's go now to someone who should know about such things, our economics correspondent, Kathleen Hayes. Kathleen, both welcome, and over to you.
Thank you, Lou. Thank you very much. Well, I would like to start by saying that the president of the Dallas Federal Reserve Bank, Bob McTeer, pulled himself together and gave a speech today in Texas. And one of the things he said about the economy is it's too soon to assess the macroeconomic consequences. And I think we're going to be hearing that kind of commentary from Fed officials for the next few days. They need to see things settle. They especially need to see the financial markets open and get going again before they really make any conclusions. Beyond that, it's ironic that rebuilding after this calamity is going to be a stimulus to the economy. We'll see a larger GDP at some point. We won't see a subtraction for all the destruction. In the near term, Kitty Pilgrim just talked about the impact on retail sales. Deborah just talking about this big spike in gas prices. Now that's going to take money out of people's pockets. A very important question is consumer confidence. It's fragile. We know the economy is weak, and now the question is, what will this do? So it's a big question in terms of the economy. And then, of course, there's also some questions about the Federal Reserve. McTeer also in his speech today made the point that the Federal Reserve is fully functioning. And while people are talking a lot about what size interest rate cut we're going to get, the first thing the Fed is doing is making sure that there is plenty of liquidity for the banks, for the financial markets to keep going.
Well, Kathleen, you make a very important point talking about liquidity versus interest rate cuts. A lot of focus until this tragedy on interest rate cuts. But moving $80 billion of liquidity into the world financial systems, as the central banks have done, is frankly far more important.
Absolutely, because as you know, the thing we have to do is maintain confidence in our financial system, and that's one of the Fed's first priorities, is to back up the system in times of distress. You remember in the 1987 stock market crash, one of the first things Greenspan did was to come out and say the Fed stands ready to provide liquidity.
And the confidence that's being asserted in these markets, the New York Bond Club had canceled its meeting for tomorrow night. And we learned today that indeed that's been changed.
That's very interesting, isn't it, Lou? Very important that apparently the White House said, no, don't cancel the speech. We want Mr. Lindsay to speak. Again, we want to show the world that we are still up and running. Parallel to that, the Bond Market Association, which apparently is calling for trading tomorrow. This is a recommendation. They make it clear. Nobody has to trade. Right. And the dealers themselves have a lot of questions about the phone systems. Only one broker right now is fully functioning. But apparently, I spoke to a couple of people who are members, and they say that there was considerable urging, if not pressure, from the Treasury Department to, if you please could, go out and trade tomorrow.
And we should be clear, the men and women who run these brokerages and these bond houses, they want that trading restored as well to establish vigor and stability in the world fixed income markets
Well,
as well.
and don't you get the feeling when you talk to people, too, that so many people have lost colleagues, comrades, and I think also maybe out of respect for them to keep going and to maintain a very strong tradition and pride that these people really have as professionals in their business.
You see in a tragedy like this, and unfortunately there has never been a tragedy like this with its dimension, that Wall Street is about a lot more than simply money and greed and fear. It's about a commitment to a way of life as well, and we're going to see that amply demonstrated, I know we're all sure, over the next several days. Kathleen, thank you. Kathleen Hayes. Well, in the wake of yesterday's attacks, Washington is taking dramatic steps to ensure financial stability both here and abroad. And Tim O'Brien has that part of our story tonight. Tim?
Lou, the Bush administration and the Federal Reserve have acted firmly over the last 36 hours to assure the safety of the U.S. financial system, even with some senior U.S. officials traveling overseas. Alan Greenspan was back at the Fed by early afternoon, returning via U.S. military jet from meetings in Switzerland. But even from Europe, the Fed chairman did direct the injection of billions of dollars of added liquidity into the system. The Fed also made what it calls a substantially higher level of loans directly to banks yesterday through its discount window. The Fed tells Moneyline that it will keep that source of liquidity available past normal working hours today to ensure stability. Greenspan and the Fed are acting in concert with other central bankers, pumping a reported $120 billion of added liquidity into world markets. Meanwhile, Treasury Secretary Paul O'Neill is returning to Washington, cutting short an official visit to Asia. O'Neill called the nation's financial markets strong and resilient and expressed his belief they would continue to operate smoothly. The International Monetary Fund has also been watching world markets. While expressing dismay over the attacks against the U.S., IMF Managing Director Horst Kohler issued a statement saying the IMF projects only a limited impact on the international economy. The IMF and World Bank are also facing suggestions from city officials here in Washington that they postpone or cancel their annual meetings scheduled for September 29th and 30th here. Sources at both organizations tell Moneyline no decision has been made, but the issue will face serious discussion in coming days. Lou?
Tim, thank you. Tim O'Brien from Washington. Well, I'd like to close with a few personal words tonight. As we have looked at the devastation, we continue to watch what is apparently the collapse of further structures in downtown Manhattan. There's an overwhelming sense of loss here. The men and women you listen to each night here on CNN all have friends, people we have worked with, people we talk with, to bring you the best information we can about markets and this economy every night. But as we share the pain and the loss, we also know that as this rebuilding begins, that we will, in point of fact, renew commitment to larger ideals, something called democratic capitalism. This remains the heart of that spirit and that effort, and I believe firmly you will see that come to reality in the days and the weeks ahead as we build anew. I'm Lou Dobbs in New York. Good night, and now Aaron Brown.
Lou, thank you. Thank you for your work and your words there. We continue to keep our eye behind the smoke there on One Liberty Plaza. This is the building that about an hour or so ago officials started to evacuate people from ground zero, getting them out of there because they began to believe that that building might collapse. Periodically we have seen pieces of glass, pieces of facing fall off the building. It is very clear to us as we look down on the scene that almost everyone, not quite everyone, has been moved back. One of the markers for us all day has been a fire truck which has been pouring water on Building 7 of the World Trade Complex, one of the buildings that collapsed. That fire truck about 10 minutes ago stopped pouring water and is now, at least so appears to me, backing out of there. Again, this is just eyeballing this. We don't see anyone down there that we would describe as a civilian. Everybody has been pulled out. About 10 minutes or so ago, Mayor Giuliani and Joe Alba, the FEMA director, the Federal Emergency Management Agency director, walked to the scene. They were followed by a large motorcade. They walked to the scene. That is the situation. We keep our eye on the building, and we go back to Judy Woodruff in Washington. Judy.
And you are, of course, recapping what we do know at this point about what's going on in New York. I know CNN at one point had confirmed that at least part of that structure at One Liberty Plaza had actually caved in, and I know we're going to follow it and come back to you as soon as need be if something more happens there. I will just tell you that here in Washington, a flag was unfurled this evening at the Pentagon near the site of where the commercial jet plowed into that building yesterday. The flag there to welcome President Bush, who went to the Pentagon to look at the damage and to talk to workers to offer his consolation. I think you have to say, looking at that flag, that it clearly is a symbol that the United States, the Pentagon, indeed the United States, will prevail no matter what enemies of this country might do to us. CNN's Jonathan Karl, has been at the Capitol all day talking to members of Congress. Jonathan, bring us up to date from there.
Well, two things you should know about, Judy. One is that there's been serious discussion among the members of the Congress here, both House and Senate, about whether or not there would be a need to have a declaration of war against who. It's unclear right now, but a declaration of war against whatever state or non-state entities might have been involved in these attacks. This is an idea that's been pushed very strongly by many Republicans, including Arlen Specter, who talked about it on the floor of the Senate today, and also on the Democratic side, Robert Torricelli talked about some kind of declaration of war. Part of the discussion here, but let me tell you, Judy, as you saw the Congress pass what it did pass today, which was a more generalized resolution condemning this and calling for support for the president in his response, you did see talk from many members that we are already at war. The other thing I want to bring you up to date on is the question of how to pay for all the damage. Now, we do know that this morning that the president himself did ask congressional leaders, I know you're going to talk to Tom Daschle shortly, for essentially a blank check for enough money as would be necessary to deal with this. Congressional investigators here looked into what the precedent was. What happened when Pearl Harbor was bombed? Was the president given a blank check? Well, no. Congressional staffers here have looked into it. They have found never has the Congress turned over the power of the purse to the president, even in a time of emergency as is this. So right now, on both House and Senate side, you have appropriators working with the White House, trying to come up with a figure of how much money they would need to deal with this, and they are offering whatever money is necessary, but there will be a number. I've been told it's going to be $11 billion or more. The House is hoping to actually debate this and have this on the floor of the House by tomorrow morning, providing the money that will be necessary to clean up what we're seeing in New York and, of course, do everything else that is associated with dealing with this emergency. Judy.
All right, Jonathan Karl of the Capitol, and as you say, the Senate Majority Leader Tom Daschle does join us now. Senator, what about that figure of $11 billion? Is that what Congress is going to end up offering the president?
Well, Judy, I think it's premature to come to any conclusion as to what the figure will be. I think we can say for absolutely certain that we're going to use whatever resources may be required. We'll work with the administration. We'll get our best assessment as to what the costs will entail, and we will appropriate that amount. But there will not be a dispute in this city about the amount of money to commit to because we're committed to doing all that it takes to make sure that the resources will be there.
Well, Senator, when it was clear that the Congress would not offer the president a so-called blank check, what does that mean the president would not get that he'd be asking for?
Well, the president hasn't asked for a blank check, to my knowledge. What he has said is that he wanted to work with us to find the appropriate amount of resources that will be required to ensure that we can address all of the many, many challenges that we know we're going to face. What we have said in return is that we are prepared to work with you to come up with whatever requirements may be necessary through appropriations, and that's where it's been left right now. We'll know a lot more, and we'll be a lot more specific as we have time available to us to make those decisions and to acquire the information required.
Senator, what should the United States do now by way of retaliation?
Well, I think the most important thing we can do now first and foremost, is to recognize the tremendous loss, Judy, that has been experienced. I don't think anyone ought to minimize that, and anytime we talk about future action, we've got to go to where the real tragedy lies, and that's with the loss of families and the loss of so much of human life in the last 24 hours. Beyond that, I think it's important for us to gather all of the information. I think everybody is so angry they want to hit somebody, but before we hit somebody, we better know who the somebody is. We better have our facts, we better have our information, and we better have a plan.
Senator, as I'm talking to you, we're looking at pictures of President Bush visiting the Pentagon a little while ago, meeting with employees there, obviously offering his condolences, talking to people, having inspected the damage. This footage we just got, and we're showing our viewers these pictures. Senator, while we look at these shots of the president visiting the Pentagon, people are asking, I hear what you're saying about wanting to make sure that everything is done to take care of the victims. Of course, we all feel that way, but there is a strong feeling that, and it's been expressed not just by the administration, but by others, that the United States cannot let something like this stand. And my question to you is, what does that mean?
Well, we will not let it stand. We will punish the perpetrators. We will take action, and we will show our resolve. But I think we, as we have in so many cases in the past, we have to be smart about it. We knew who the enemy was that bombed Pearl Harbor. We know who the enemies are in most cases involving war. I think we need to ensure we can identify the enemy, identify the locations of the enemy, and make sure we've got a plan put into place that will allow us the maximum degree of ability to punish those responsible. That can't happen tomorrow. It can't happen within the next couple of days for sure, but it will happen. I think we just have to ensure that we have all of the pieces together prior to the time we make it happen.
But Senator, when the President, when Secretary of State Powell and others say we are not just going to go after the terrorists, we're going to go after those who are harboring the terrorists, don't we have a pretty clear idea of what countries, what states have harbored, have offered aid and comfort to these people?
Well, I think there is a general understanding of that. Obviously, as we look to what we're going to do now, we're going to have to take that into account. And that is part of this fact-gathering process that must now be underway. But clearly, we've got to have more than just that, some vague notion of where these terrorists have lived in the past. We've got to know with a lot more precise detail what exactly we're going to do about it and what warning we're going to give and what actions may be required of those who may still be harboring terrorists today.
But, Senator, at the same time, I'm hearing calls and reading calls from those who say we shouldn't wait for the judicial process to work its way, for there to be a long, drawn-out investigation and a court proceeding, that the United States needs to move more quickly than that.
Well, I don't know that I disagree with much of that. I do think, though, that it is important for us to ensure that we do this smartly. I'm not saying do it with every legal question answered, because we may not be able to resolve all of these questions legally. But we do have a responsibility to do it correctly and to do it swiftly, but do it with all of the facts, and that's exactly what I think this country is doing today.
What do you mean by swiftly? Can you put some sort of timetable on it?
No, I think it would be a mistake to put a timetable arbitrarily on whatever actions we're going to take. We know it's going to be done. We know actions will be taken. We just ought to be patient, but also continue through other actions to show our resolve. We did that today on the Senate and House floor. We are going to continue to do that in our work in cooperation with the President of the United States and this administration.
Senator, I'm talking to you as we've just been continuing to watch the raw footage, pictures of President Bush visiting with employees, both military and civilian, at the Pentagon, and I want to apologize to our viewers. Those pictures were pretty shaky, and as I say, it was unedited. We aired it just as it came in. One final question, Senator Daschle. How long is this spirit of cooperation between your party, the Democrats, and the Republicans going to last in the aftermath of this terrible tragedy?
Well, Judy, on matters pertaining to this crisis, I hope it lasts until the very, very last moment it's required. We have a new day, a new crisis, a new challenge, and I think, therefore, a new responsibility. And we're going to live up to that responsibility to the very best of our ability, regardless of how long it may take.
And finally, when does the Congress get back to business? We're
going to take up the Commerce and State Justice Appropriations Bill tomorrow. That was the pending business on Monday, and we hope to complete it this week.
All right, Senator Tom Daschle, who was the majority leader in the United States Senate. Thank you very much. Good to see you, Senator. For more in the aftermath of this tragedy that has shaken all of us, for more now on the emotions of the people who have been affected by it, CNN's Candy Crowley now.
At daybreak, the nightmare was still there, smoldering and burning, defying the imagination, thwarting rescue efforts, and testing an untested president.
The United States of America will use all our resources to conquer this enemy. We will rally the world. We will be patient, we'll be focused, and we will be steadfast in our determination. This battle will take time and resolve, but make no mistake about it, we will win.
8 months in office, President George Bush is already writing what may be the most important page of his own legacy. In an unusual revelation, officials said both the White House and Air Force One may have been targets. The news sheds some light on the president's first hours following the attacks when, instead of returning immediately to Washington, he flew from Florida to a military base in Louisiana and then another in Nebraska. Today, in both New York and Washington, the precarious nature of the rubble and the hellish heat of the fire frustrated attempts to reach the wounded, the dying, or the dead. Still, in Manhattan, they rescued alive and reasonably well 9 firefighters and police officers who had been buried beneath the debris. Their recovery fueled a round-the-clock search that runs mostly on adrenaline and hope.
I think once the cranes and the iron workers start getting the big stuff out of the way, we can get in there and do some nitpicking and maybe find some guys. There's a lot of voids, it seems, down there, so maybe there are some guys available.
But at the Pentagon, hope is gone. Officials say whoever might have survived the concussion of the plane's impact could not have lived through the fires that came after. There's no official estimate of how many lives were lost at the Pentagon or the World Trade Center. Authorities say they don't know, but everybody knows it will be awful. The FBI says it's identified most of the suicidal terrorists on the planes. Now they search for those behind the mayhem.
We also have identified through a number of leads, principally at the cities of origin, a number of individuals whom we believe may have had something to do with the hijackings, and we are pursuing those leads aggressively.
It is a very public manhunt. The FBI conducted a shoulder-to-shoulder search for evidence outside the Pentagon. Authorities in Providence, Rhode Island halted and boarded a Washington-bound Amtrak train, detaining at least one passenger. A SWAT team descended on a Boston hotel in search of suspects. No arrests were made. Authorities also searched a Vero Beach, Florida home and questioned others in the southern Florida area. The visibility of the efforts backs up the clear message from all arms of the federal government.
We will find out who is responsible for this, and they will pay for it.
I guess I'm kind of old-fashioned. I'm inclined to think that if you're going to cock it, you throw it.
Terrorism's reach goes far beyond the areas of immediate destruction. The nation's airliners still aren't flying as the FAA institutes new security requirements and carriers search for ways to comply. Wall Street remains closed, and for a second evening there'll be no Major League Baseball, the all-American pastime canceled by this un-American horror. Symbolically, personally, financially, the country is so wounded. The totality of the loss is incomprehensible, but the details are unbearable.
Someone on the 104th floor worked for the good firm of Cantor and Fitzgerald. We can't find hardly anybody from that firm who called his parents, told them he loved him, and they haven't heard from him since.
There are stories like it everywhere. People, knowing they are about to die, calling home to say, "I love you." People running for their lives and then stopping to carry a stranger to safety. The story here is that what prevailed in the final moment, in the face of death, is not fear or hate, but love and courage. Candy Crowley, CNN, Washington.
And those are the stories that bring us down and lift us up. at the same time. Our Jonathan Karl was reporting just a little while ago, and I also was talking with Senate Democratic leader Tom Daschle a minute ago about appropriations to pay for the cleanup, the crisis of this crisis. I'm told that the chairman of the House Appropriations Committee is reporting that now the House and the Senate have agreed on a figure of $20 billion, an emergency supplemental payment that would be spent at the desire of the administration, the White House, to deal with the crisis. The House and Senate are going to take this supplemental up tomorrow. They plan to have it on President Bush's desk by the end of business, by the end of the day tomorrow. Aaron, back to you in New York.
Judy, thank you. We continue to keep our eye just to the left of what was Building 7, this large gray building, One Liberty Plaza. When we first heard the concern that this building might come down, we saw windows and facing on the west side, the right side of your screen popping out. Now we can see, and we suspect you can as well. Yes, indeed. Some of the windows now further to the east, more to the center of the building, on the seam line there, starting to pop out also. A large number of ambulances, 1, 2, 3 that I can see, 4, 5, 6, 7 at least that I can see, have moved into the area, moving towards the area as we talk to you now. People have been pulled out, though there is still, and Danny, I'm not sure if you can see it or not on the shot you're on, there's still a fair number of fire officials in that blown out area that is was a street yesterday and is now just a kind of wasteland there just ahead of the fire truck. There's still a fair number of people there, and we watched that building. And just for a moment, think about the implications here. That building, if it collapses, causes collateral damage. If that building doesn't collapse, but remains a danger to collapse, the rescue operation, if not totally shut down, is largely shut down. Now, I'm sure smarter people than I are figuring out how they're going to deal with this, but they have an enormous problem, about a 60-story problem, just to the east of the Trade Center. Some of the most fascinating reporting that we have heard today has come from CNN's Miles O'Brien. Miles has been following the flight paths and whatever information on board the 4 hijacked airplanes he could gather as he worked his sources and his computer and the rest. Miles joins us in Atlanta now with more on the detail, some cases shocking detail, of what he's been able to learn. Miles?
Shocking, horrifying, it all applies when you start looking at these 4 doomed flights, Aaron. Take a look here. This is the track of the 2 flights which left Boston. They were headed to the West Coast. Ultimately, of course, they ended up right near where Aaron is, striking the World Trade Center, eventually leveling them. Those flight paths are somewhat more clear-cut when you consider the goals of the terrorists. The flight that has caused us great interest today is this one, United Airlines Flight 93, which left from Newark Airport, made it as far as Cleveland, and did a 180-degree turn and seemed to be heading in toward the Baltimore-Washington area. Unclear what the target was, but the question that has been on our minds all day long is, why did this plane crash here? Was there perhaps some sort of struggle inside the cockpit of that particular aircraft? And we do know more about that now. But first, let me tell you a little bit about some of the other flights and what was going on board.
Nothing seemed amiss when American Airlines Flight 11 left the runway in Boston Tuesday morning. The 767-200 was about half full, toting 81 passengers, a cockpit crew of 2, and 9 flight attendants to the opposite coast. The captain likely planned for a 5-hour flight, so there was roughly 8,500 gallons of jet fuel in its 3 tanks. FAA radars tracked the airliner as it followed the flight plan. But then, about 20 minutes into the flight, somewhere over upstate New York, it turned sharply to the south. Flight 11 was hijacked, apparently by knife-wielding men. Airline pilots are trained to handle such situations by keeping calm, complying with requests, and, if possible, dialing in an emergency 4-digit code on a device called a transponder. It transmits crucial flight data to air traffic controllers. The action takes seconds, but it appears no such code was entered. But in the cabin, a frantic flight attendant managed to use a phone to call American Airlines Command Center in Dallas. She reported the trouble, and according to the Christian Science Monitor, a pilot apparently keyed the microphone, transmitting a cockpit conversation. The hijackers could be heard saying, "We have more planes, we have more planes." Radio transmissions like this would have been recorded on the ground by the FAA.
The police have identified 5 suspects that they believe were involved with this terrorist act, and 2 of whom may be brothers, apparently, reportedly. 2 of whom, 2 others, may have flown in from Portland and originated in Canada.
About 5 minutes before Flight 11 started heading south, another 767, United Flight 175, left Boston, also for Los Angeles, 65 souls aboard. 15 minutes after becoming airborne, it veered off course. One passenger made 2 calls to his father. In one exchange, he said a flight attendant was stabbed. In the second call, he told his dad the plane was going down.
They knew not to carry guns on the airplane if they fired off a bullet. I mean, they could have had explosive decompression on the aircraft. They knew what they were doing, and they knew what their mission was, obviously.
We know what happened next. The 767 struck and ultimately leveled the World Trade Center's twin towers.
I know pilots. No, if you're going to die, you're not going to fly in a World Trade Center to do it. Yeah, there would be a struggle, major struggle.
Which brings us to the story of Jeremy Glick. Jeremy Glick was a passenger on board United Airlines Flight 93. Newark to Los Angeles was the intended destination. According to his family, he made a phone call after the plane became commandeered somewhere around here in the Cleveland area. He asked them to confirm reports that other passengers had heard from talking to their family members that, in fact, a plane had already crashed into the World Trade Center here in the New York area. When that was confirmed by his family, he dropped the phone for some time, came back to report to his family that the male passengers on board United Airlines Flight 93 had voted to attack the hijackers. Dropped the phone again. And the rest we can only surmise. But this flight did not make it to what appeared to be its intended target, the Washington, D.C. area. If you're looking for heroes, the passengers on board that plane, obviously now perished, would be them. Aaron?
Miles, there's going to be no shortage of heroes here as we keep our eye on One Liberty Plaza, about 8 blocks from where we are, as windows continue to pop out of that building. Just in the last 5 minutes or so, another half dozen ambulances have moved in. Look, I can't honestly tell you that these ambulances that I now see were not in another part of the staging area too close to that building and have been moved around several blocks and back down. That is certainly possible. It is also possible that they are very concerned that this building's coming down and they want to make sure that they can treat the people who might be hurt. Which one of those possibilities, I honestly can't tell you. I can tell you that there is a sea of ambulances down there. Patty Davis has been covering today transportation questions. I think all of us have known that flying, at least in the near term, is not going to be the same, and in fact the rules are changing. Patty, good evening.
Certainly changing, Aaron. The FAA has said that it is now accepting flight plans from some commercial airlines to get back in the air. Now, that only applies to a limited number of flights, those that were diverted yesterday when these acts of terrorism occurred. Both domestically and those that are in Canada, were diverted in Canada, will be allowed now to come into the United States. Now, Transportation Secretary Norman Mineta says those limited number of flights will operate under much tighter security.
Only passengers on the original flights will be allowed to reboard under strict security, and only after airports and airlines have implemented strict screening measures.
Now, the ground stop continues for most other flights. Only diverted flights are being allowed to file their flight plans with the FAA. The FAA saying the ground stop continues, has been extended. No timetable for all those other flights has been set at this point. FAA says, though, that those flights will not resume definitely before sometime tomorrow. And of course, all those airports and those airlines have to meet these new tougher restrictions, these security restrictions that the FAA has now beefed up. Those include no knives, including plastic knives, on board airlines. No curbside or off-airport check-in. Only ticketed passengers will be allowed past the metal detectors, as the Secretary said. Higher standards for security personnel as well. And there will be more federal air marshals, it should say air marshals in there, at large airports. Also, we are told that anyone with an e-ticket who normally would go directly to the gate, not allowed to do that anymore. Even if you have a boarding pass issued from your travel agent, you will no longer be allowed to go directly to the gate. Everyone must stop at the ticket counter and check in. Aaron?
Thank you. Mike Miller is with Aviation Daily as we keep our camera posted here on One Liberty Plaza, and we'll just kind of watch this for a bit, and we'll talk to Mike. Mike, you know, maybe I'm about to say the unspeakable here, but I'm not sure that I'd want that there are a whole lot of people out there that want to be the first person to get on an airplane tomorrow.
Yeah, the thing that everybody should realize who's even considering traveling in the next couple days is because there's been so much ambiguity today from DOT about exactly when anybody can do anything, that when it's all over, it still won't be over. There's still going to be confusion. The employees at the airport won't really know exactly what to do. There should be 1 million people trying to fly tomorrow. Normally there'd be about 1 million this time of year, and yet we have absolutely no direction about what will happen tomorrow, whether the planes will be allowed to take off first thing in the morning. So people with tickets still are in limbo.
Well, help me on this, because it does seem to me that one of the problems, no matter when they lift this flying ban, is going to be you've got airplanes in a lot of places where they're not necessarily supposed to be. And then one of the things the airlines are going to have to do is figure out how to get that plane that was supposed to go New York to Cleveland into New York or into Cleveland, because it's in Houston.
Right. There's actually not as many planes in different places than you might think, because most of the flights were shut down before 10 o'clock in the morning or so on Tuesday, so there's not a full day's travel schedule that's been disrupted. There are 250 planes in Canada that have to get back to the United States, and presumably some of those will get back tonight. But anybody who is considering traveling, who has been following this story, probably should try to be very flexible and say, well, can you get me, instead of to San Francisco, to Oakland, instead of Los Angeles, maybe to San Diego, because there will be a whole big backlog of people that have been trying to get out for 2 days, and it's going to be a mess, I would think, for at least the next week, probably further.
And, you know, I guess it goes without saying, and we always say that just before we say something, that people need to allow, if in fact we get some flights in the air, and the country starts to return to some sort of normalcy, that they need to allow a lot more time than they even did before. I mean, the airlines would say 45 minutes. I think this is about right, half hour, 45 minutes before a domestic flight. Give me an idea of how much time you would say right now.
Well, just my own personal approach, I would try to go and arrive at the airport 2 hours before my flight. 1, to check and monitor things. 2, to ask questions. 3, to allow for the extra security across each step of the way. There will be extra security just getting into the building in every airport. There will be extra security checking in. There will be longer lines and probably a longer time to get through those metal detectors. And each plane has to be inspected before passengers get on it, and nobody really knows how long that's going to take either.
And those questions that they routinely ask, did you pack your own bags? Did anyone give you anything? Nobody's going to answer them as nonchalantly as they did a few days ago. Mike, thanks. Mike Miller of Aviation Daily joining us. Judy?
Aaron, those are the kinds of precautions that I know that people flying into and out of Israel have grown quite accustomed to. They've become routine in that nation, which has seen terrorism become part of its life. We're going to be prepared to go back to Aaron at any moment as we watch that 60-story building close to him as it gets shakier and shakier, if you will, and may be on the verge of collapsing. Right now, we want to show you President Bush visiting the Pentagon. Just a short time ago, he went over across the Potomac River to pay a visit to employees there to inspect the damage, and after he took a look, here's what he had to say.
Secretary and I are, first of all, I must tell you, I am overwhelmed by the devastation. I am so grateful for the people who are working here. We're here to say thanks to not only the workers on this site, but the workers who are doing the same work in New York City. I want to say thanks to the folks who have given blood to the Red Cross. I want to say thanks for the hundreds and thousands of Americans who pray for the victims and their families. Secretary Rumsfeld told me when I talked to him that he felt the blast shake the Pentagon. Even though he was on the other side of the building rocked. And now I know why. Coming here makes me sad on the one hand. It also makes me angry. And our country will, however, not be cowed by terrorists, by people who don't share the same values we share, by people who are willing to destroy people's lives because we embrace freedom. Our nation mourns, but our government will go on. Our country will function. We're on high alert for any possible activity. But coming here confirms what the Secretary and I both know, that this is a great nation. The people here working hard prove it. People out here working their hearts out to answer families' questions, to remove the rubble and debris from this awful scene. And again, thank everybody, not only in this site, but all across America, who are responding so generously, so kindly in their prayers, and their contributions of blood, and their willingness to help in any way they can.
President Bush visiting the Pentagon just a short time ago, where they have only begun to pull out the victims and to clean up the damage. CNN was part of a poll that was conducted last evening in the aftermath of yesterday's terrible acts, and our senior political analyst Bill Schneider joins me now to tell us about the poll and what the American people are saying. Bill.
Well, Judy, people see this as far more than a crime or an isolated terrorist incident. That came through loud and clear in 4 different polls, one of them by us, all taken last night. In our own poll, 86% of Americans described yesterday's attack as an act of war against the United States. Now, you remember President Bush warned last night, we will make no distinction between the terrorists who committed those crimes and those who harbor them. And the public agrees with that. In the Washington Post ABC News poll, 84% supported military action against countries that assist or shelter terrorists. There's also agreement on one other point. We'll get them. In all 4 polls, majorities said that they were very confident that the United States would be able to find and punish the people responsible. So not only do Americans believe we're at war, they're confident we'll win.
And Bill, when people were asked to what extent they view this as a turning point in American history?
Well, you know, that's a startling and dramatic finding from a poll taken last night by Ipsos Reid. 3/4 of the public said that they see these events as a turning point that will fundamentally change things forever. Only 21% believe that things will eventually in this country return to normal. To Americans, yesterday was like Pearl Harbor Day and the day John F. Kennedy was shot. Everyone will remember for the rest of their lives exactly where they were and what they were doing when they heard the terrible news. And like the Kennedy assassination in Pearl Harbor, yesterday's events will change America forever. Judy?
All right, Bill Schneider. And now we want to go down to Atlanta to CNN's Mike Betcher for the latest on what you've been working on in terms of the investigation into all this. Mike?
Well, Judy, the investigation has been moving very rapidly up and down the East Coast. Some of the leads have been very fruitful. The FBI has been moving ahead and trying to identify the various suspects. Now, cars that investigators believe were left behind by suspected terrorists at Boston Logan Airport and at Portland International Airport have borne fruit for investigators, especially that car at Boston's Logan Airport, where they found material written in Arabic that investigators say was very helpful and positive. Helpful how? Well, it apparently led to the identity of two suspects, Mohammed Atta and Marwan Youssef Al-Shehi. Investigators went to Huffman Aviation in Venice, Florida, after they identified those two people, where they believe the two men received pilot training. Now, CNN has learned those two men have commercial pilot's licenses. Now, in another part of Florida, in Vero Beach, Florida, the FBI has apparently tracked down the identity of two other suspects. Police searched the homes of Adnan Bukhari and his brother Amir Abbas Bukhari. Law enforcement sources believe they are both Saudi citizens and commercial pilots. One of the addresses listed for them is a post office box in Jeddah, Saudi Arabia, at Saudi Airlines. So the bottom line is they have at least 4 suspects, and 4 of those are commercial pilots, Judy.
All right, Mike Betcher, I know this information is coming in bits and pieces, and we want to try to report it as it comes in. Mike Betcher, thanks very much. Well, we've been telling you, and our colleagues in New York, Aaron Brown and others have been telling us about those rescue efforts in New York, people literally risking their lives now in order to see if there's anyone left alive in the rubble of the World Trade Center. Right now, CNN's national correspondent Gary Tuchman is on the telephone to tell us what is going on with that building very much at risk. Gary?
Well, Judy, there is a deep feeling of unease in the lower portion of Manhattan tonight. The building is called One Liberty Plaza. It's a very tall, grayish-black building that is just to the east of where the 2 World Trade Center towers were. About 2 hours ago, I was brought to ground zero to see the 1,000 to 1,500 workers who are on the scene working at the wreckage. I was told when I was there they were deeply concerned about that One Liberty Plaza building and another building to the south that has a huge hole in it. These are very brave people. They are walking on top of wreckage, and in some cases is 75 feet tall, lifting up heavy metal with the knowledge that 2 buildings nearby are vulnerable. Well, about 30 minutes after I was there, they started noticing that that One Liberty Plaza building started twisting, and then windows started popping out of the building. Immediately, an evacuation was ordered, and now all 1,000 to 1,500 people have evacuated the area. There is no one at the scene right now participating in the rescue and recovery. In addition, members of the news media who were about 4 or 5 blocks away from the World Trade Center site were told to immediately start moving back a couple of blocks to get farther away from the building. The fear is, and we should make this very clear, there is no evidence this building is coming down. But there is a concern that it could happen. And if the building did come down, and that's still a long shot in my estimation based on talking to people, it could potentially knock down other buildings nearby, creating a very huge problem. And that's why the area has been evacuated. I should tell you, Judy, being at the site, one thing that I must stress, this is a much worse disaster in terms of damage than I ever imagined, even being 4 blocks away. When I got there, we are talking about damage to maybe 100 to 150 businesses that aren't part of the World Trade Center complex, some very substantial. There is debris and damage in a 10-square-block area in each direction from the World Trade Center complex. A morgue has been set up across from the World Trade Center in a damaged Brooks Brothers store. That's where people who have perished have been brought. And there is a center, a triage center, set up in the One Liberty Plaza building. So there might be a concern when you evacuated that building, what happens to the people in the triage center? Well, sadly, there's no one in the triage center because they haven't found any survivors in the past several hours. Judy?
All right, Gary, I want to have one more question I want to ask you, and as I do, I believe we're going to be able to show our viewers some very unusual pictures from the International Space Station. These are pictures of New York City from space. So that now I'm seeing this for the first time, just as you are. The smoke you're able to see is clearly that coming from that area of lower Manhattan that Gary has been reporting on. Gary, I don't think you're in a position to see this, but it certainly does give us the bird's eye view of the city and just one more idea of the incredible devastation wrought by yesterday's acts of terrorism. Gary, one last question while I'm talking to you. How close now are the emergency personnel to the area that of the devastation, given the risk of this One Liberty Plaza building? Are people still in the immediate adjacent area?
I can tell you, Judy, that many of the rescue and recovery workers are standing with me right now, and we're about 4 or 5 blocks away. People aren't getting very close at this point because of the risk. I also wanted to mention, you're talking about the smoke that could be seen from space. It's a surreal sight here because most of us are carrying masks with us and people are walking down the streets wearing masks, wearing bandanas over their face and their nose because too much time spent without the mask or the bandana leaves you with a sore throat because of all the fumes that have been prevalent here for the last day and a half.
All right, Gary Tuchman, and we are now looking at, we're going to be showing you live pictures of the building. We've been discussing this building at One Liberty Plaza at risk of collapse, although as you heard Gary say, there's no clear proof, there's no clear evidence that it will collapse, but it is believed that there's just a good chance that it could happen, and given the horrendous devastation that would mean, the effect on other buildings nearby, people are out of there. They have been moved blocks away, and everyone is watching this building. Close to the World Trade Center, but just giving you an idea of how many buildings are involved in what happened yesterday. And even as we watch the scenes in New York, we are back here in Washington following developments at the Pentagon. President Bush just visiting there a short time ago to inspect the damage himself. Our military affairs correspondent Jamie McIntyre is at the Pentagon right now. Jamie.
Well, this visit by President Bush across the Potomac River to inspect the damage here at the Pentagon was marked by a moment of high symbolism as workers, rescue workers and firefighters unfurled a huge American flag from the roof of the Pentagon and hung it over the side of the building that was took the brunt of that attack from an airliner right into the side of the building. That flag flew as President Bush personally thanked some of the rescue workers for their hard work, despite the fact that the Pentagon has now given up hope that there were any survivors left in the building. There were about 60 people injured who are being treated at area hospitals. President Bush spoke briefly to the workers and told them that this incident had simply increased his determination.
Coming here makes me sad on the one hand. It also makes me angry. And our country will, however, not be cowed by terrorists, by people who don't share the same values we share, by people who are willing to destroy people's lives.
The casualties in that section of the Pentagon has turned out not to be nearly as high as was initially feared. Pentagon sources now say that they think the number will end up being somewhere between 100 and 200 deaths. something that Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld alluded to in a briefing earlier today.
We currently believe and are certainly hopeful that the number of casualties being reported in the press is high. As you know from your own observation out there, the work is still going forward, and we won't know for some time precise numbers.
For all intents and purposes, the fire in the Pentagon is out, although there are still some smoldering areas. Fire officials say technically the fire is simply under control. The big question now is what next? What in terms of a possible military response? That was presumably the subject of a meeting between President Bush and Defense Secretary Rumsfeld that took place in his office after this inspection. Judy?
And Jamie, I presume that means it's too soon to know what was discussed. Jamie, I just have one question. We think of people, the members of our armed forces, as being a pretty stoic bunch, if you will, but you've been covering that building for a long time, covering people in the military for quite some time. How are they affected by all this?
Well, I think it actually has resulted in a feeling of determination. There is a feeling that they were attacked, that this wasn't an accident, that it was a deliberate act. The people who described the actual evacuation of the building right in the aftermath of this incident tell me that it was people were very calm despite the tragedy that was taking place around them. And there was a real, of course, there's a real bond felt between members of the military. By the way, this wedge is basically the Navy wedge, and almost all the deaths are expected to be either in the Navy or the Army, which also had some offices nearby. But there's a real sense of resolve after this attack.
All right, Jamie McIntyre reporting from the Pentagon. Well, as we've been hearing today, as the hours have gone by, new details, dramatic details surfacing about what happened on board those planes before they crashed into the World Trade Center, into the Pentagon, and the plane that crashed into a rural area in western Pennsylvania. CNN's That Was United Airlines Flight 93. CNN's Rusty Dornan tells us more about that.
38-year-old Thomas Burnett called his wife Dina from Flight 93 4 times Tuesday. The first call, he told her his plane was hijacked. A passenger had been knifed. On the second call, his wife told him about the crash at the World Trade Center. The third, Burnett wanted details about the Trade Center crash. His wife said it was like he was puzzling it out. By the fourth call, he'd made a decision with some other passengers.
On the last phone call, he said that a group of them were getting ready to do something. And then he hung up and he never called back.
Did he say anything to you personally?
He did not. And that, I know the reason he didn't is he was fighting to come home. He had every intention of being here that night.
15 minutes before Flight 93 flew into the ground, another call. Mark Bingham, a San Francisco public relations executive, phoned his mother, Alice, who happens to be a United flight attendant. He told her he loved her.
I'm on a flight from Newark to San Francisco, and there are 3 guys that have taken over the plane, and they say they have a bomb. And I said, Mark, who are they? I said, Mark, I love you too. And I said, who are these guys? And then he seemed to be pulled away from the phone for a minute.
Hoagland says her son didn't seem panicked.
His voice was calm. He seemed very much composed, even though I know he must have been under terrible duress.
Burnett also said her husband seemed very cool. In her heart, she believes if the plane was averted from another target, her husband likely had something to do with it.
He went down fighting. I know he did. His adrenaline was going. He was not whispering. He was talking quickly, and he was ready to do something.
Wednesday at Burnett's church in San Ramon, California. A remembrance of a man whose final moments may have been spent fighting for the survival of the passengers of Flight 93. Rusty Dornan, CNN, San Francisco.
Well, once again now we are in Washington, and in order to keep you updated, just a couple of details. Investigators fanning out from Boston to Florida and beyond, pursuing any leads that they can. The FBI saying it knows the identities now of many of the hijackers. Today, as we've just told you in the last few moments, crews did hang a large, huge American flag from the Pentagon. Meantime, the Bush administration saying the plane that crashed there may have been aiming for the White House, or possibly that Air Force One was a target. And in New York City, the rescue effort at the World Trade Center is on hold. It is believed that a nearby building may be about to collapse. No survivors have been found since this morning, Wednesday morning. And now for a few moments, we want to consider what those at the Capitol and the administration and at the Pentagon have been thinking and talking about today, and that is, what does the United States do now that this unspeakable acts of terror have been committed against this nation? At the White House, our senior White House correspondent, John King. Back at the Pentagon, CNN's Jamie McIntyre. John King, to you first. Just how much are they saying openly at the White House about what their options are?
Well, Judy, we know the president met twice with his national security team today, the last time just before he headed over to the Pentagon to greet rescue and relief workers there. They're not saying very much publicly at all, except the president, of course, today calling this an act of war. What they are saying here, though, is that the president is weighing his options, and we are told by senior administration officials that more and more, especially at that second National Security Council meeting today, there were discussions of potential U.S. military and diplomatic and other options to be taken down the road once they reach a conclusion point in this investigation. Senior officials telling us there are, quote, no absolutes in the investigation so far, but also another official saying, quote, everything points to the network of Osama bin Laden. So the administration building a case here, having its own internal deliberations, and the administration very encouraged by international outrage. The president himself spoke to a half-dozen world leaders today. The NATO alliance said it considered this the attack on the United States to be an attack on the alliance. The president looking to build a broad international coalition, and administration officials saying he hopes to use that coalition not only to respond to these attacks yesterday here in the United States, but also to mount a broader offensive against terrorism.
Judy. Deliberate and deadly attacks which were carried out yesterday against our country were more than acts of terror. They were acts of war. This will require our country to unite in steadfast determination and resolve. Freedom and democracy are under attack.
Now, as the president made that case in public today, Judy, a remarkable disclosure by the White House saying on the record it believed both the White House, the mansion where the president lives, and Air Force One, the plane that carries him around the world, were potential targets in these attacks. Two reasons why. Number one, the White House saying it has credible information that the plane that crashed into the Pentagon actually was initially targeting the White House, and then at the last minute decided to change its target, veer off, and hit the Pentagon instead. Number two, we are told by sources that another operating theory is that that plane that crashed outside of Pittsburgh was taking a turn toward Washington, and some officials believe its target was Andrews Air Force Base, that the hijackers believed that President Bush would be rushing back to Washington, and that perhaps there was a plan to take that plane and crash it into Andrews Air Force Base just as Air Force One was returning. That, administration sources say, is why the president did not return directly to Washington and went to two military installations before ultimately returning aboard Air Force One to Andrews Air Force Base with military fighter jets escorting him. Judy?
Just chilling pieces of information coming out. Jamie McIntyre at the Pentagon, as we listen to John, and I know we want to ask you what the administration is finding out about all this. I guess my question is, how much are they going to feel that they have to have before they decide to act?
Well, that's one of the key questions. And of course, the impulse is to act quickly, to show that the United States is capable of taking action right away. But of course, that's often not the smartest thing to do. So they're going to have to weigh the impulse to act quickly and have some military retaliation against the need to build a case and make sure that they know who it is that they want to strike. There's two elements to this. One is enough evidence of who's responsible. That's something the FBI is gathering now. And then you need enough intelligence to to know where that person or persons or organization or country is and how the best way to strike them is. And all of that would seem to indicate that it's going to have to take a little time. And of course, at the Pentagon today, Defense Secretary Rumsfeld said that nobody should think that the fight against terrorism is something that you can do quickly. It's going to take, he said, a long, sustained campaign.
And John King, when we talk about the element of time, how much time does the White House think it has before it has to make some sort of decision one way or another?
Well, I would just echo what Jamie said. Remember what happened a few years back when the Clinton administration launched strikes against suspected camps of Osama bin Laden. If indeed the bin Laden network is responsible for these attacks in the United States this week, one could make the case those Clinton administration attacks didn't do much, did they? This president not only wants, first, we're told, to have conclusive evidence in the investigation, but very much wants to build international support, not only just among predictable U.S. allies like the United Kingdom, France, and Germany. 2 conversations with the Russian president, Mr. Bush, had today, a conversation with the Chinese president, Jiang Zemin. We're told the president hoping not only to respond both militarily and economically to these attacks, but also to try to use this to build momentum, to build some good thing out of this tragedy, momentum for a broader international effort to combat not only terrorists, but the nations that harbor them and support them financially.
All right, John King reporting from the White House, Jamie McIntyre from the Pentagon. Joining us now here in Washington, Bill Bennett, a leading figure in the conservative movement in this country, former education secretary, former drug czar, and 2 different administrations. Bill Bennett, what is now with Empower America, what is the right thing now for the United States to do?
Well, I think we have a moment of moral clarity right now in America, Judy. There is good and evil in the world. There is right and there is wrong. And I think everyone apprehends that, no matter what their politics, where they are ideologically. And now, building on that moment of moral clarity, I think we need to act. We issued a statement today at Empower America, Jack Kemp and Jean Kirkpatrick and I, saying that Congress should declare war against militant Islam, and that the United States should proceed as if in war, because it is in war, to hunt down these folks.
But what does that mean? These people are scattered all over the globe, presumably.
Well, believe me, the United States can find a lot of them if we set our mind to it. I had some access to intelligence information when I was director of drug policy. You can know and find out an awful lot, and we already do know an awful lot. But it means a couple things. It means we need to be willing to kill some people who are leaders of these movements, if it is indeed these people who are responsible. And we need to explain to the American people that that's what it's going to take. I think they're with us. The second thing is we need to persevere, because if we get as tough as we should get, we may see more attacks on the United States. It's a big country. It's a free country. It's an open country. And even with restrictions that we're going to see, you will never seal the borders of this country. We know that from discussions of the drug war.
Let me just ask you, Bill Bennett, are you saying the United States should act before it has all the details that one would normally expect to have to make a legal case against someone or some group?
Well, it's not a matter of a legal case, Judy. We're not in a court of law. The President Roosevelt didn't say to Japan that he was going to bring it to justice. He said he was going to bring Japan to its knees. There's always more information to get. There are always more details to get. The question is, do we wait until we have all the information? No, because you never get all the information. When you have enough, when you have beyond a reasonable doubt, one might say, borrowing from the law, a grasp or understanding of who's responsible, then you act. I don't think this is rocket science, by the way, and I think our intelligence people probably already know who's responsible for this.
So do you have a timeline here in your mind?
The time matters less to me than that it be done well, and that it be done without equivocation, that it be done with overwhelming force, and that we understand that we're in this for the long run. I was checking my time frame. World War II, people may not realize it was 55 days before we got to the Marshall Islands after Pearl Harbor, and 101 days after till we got to Tokyo. That may seem, 55 days may seem like a long time after this one. I don't think we need to wait that long, not nearly that long. But when we do it, we should do it right, and we should make it clear that we're in this fight for the long run. This requires, if I could just say, not only something of our leaders, and I think our leader has passed his first great test. I happen to know there was a lot of pressure on George Bush to stay away last night, and we heard these reports on CNN.
You mean to stay away from Washington, from the White House?
Because of these threats. But I understand from all the information I have, is that he was the one who insisted on coming back. So score one for our leader. He's showing the courage. Now the American people are going to have to be prepared to show some courage too. They're going to have to put up with some inconveniences, but they're also going to have to put up with spending more money on defense, with making sure we're in this for the long run, and with whatever else it may take. This is obviously a serious and well-prepared enemy that could strike at the heart of America like this. This is not any pushover operation.
But just to be clear again, Bill Bennett, are you saying, I mean, is there a threshold at all which should be met before the United States, of information before the United States moves to retaliate?
Yeah, there should be a threshold. We should be pretty confident that we're getting the right people. And I don't think that's going to be hard to meet. Somewhere beyond, between preponderance of the evidence and beyond a reasonable doubt. And the track record of a lot of these militant Islam organizations are such that they can give us confidence. Notice what everybody else is saying too, Judy. Everybody, every Democrat, every Republican, and I think we should hold them to it. That it's not just these individuals and groups, but it's these nations, these states that sponsor or support. That could be a lot of people. That could be Syria, that could be Libya, that could be Lebanon, that could be Iraq and Iran, it could be China.
And if innocent people are hurt?
Innocent people are hurt in war. This country can select its targets and exercise, as we saw in the Gulf War, with incredible precision. But there are no doubt that innocent people will be hurt. But a ton of innocent people were hurt yesterday. They provoked it. They have asked for it. They should get it.
All right, Bill Bennett with Empower America, former Education Secretary. We thank you very much.
Thank you.
It's good to see you. We appreciate it. And we just want to let you know, I've just been told that over at the Capitol, which you can see behind me, preparations are underway now for a prayer vigil, which should be getting underway in just a few minutes. When it does get underway, we will take you there live, but we want to show you some of the people. Senator John Kerry, of course, Democrat of Massachusetts. We just saw Senator Ted Kennedy passing in front of the camera. Arlen Specter of Pennsylvania. This looks like a pretty broad cross-section of familiar faces in the Congress, both in the House. That's George Miller on the right from the state of California, Congressman Miller. We see Pat Leahy of Vermont, Teddy Kennedy there on the left. We see a number of members. That's Republican Senator Olympia Snowe of the state of Maine, Jim Inhofe, senator from Oklahoma, and a few others we see, and no doubt there will be a large turnout by members of Congress and others as this prayer service gets underway just outside the United States Capitol. Now we want to go across the Atlantic Ocean to London, to our chief international correspondent, Christiane Amanpour, who's been taking a look today, Christiane, at the reaction of people around the world to what's been happening here in the United States.
Judy, even this side of the Atlantic, they're calling it a declaration of war. The newspapers in England and across Europe have been blaring headlines today. Even the normally careful and sedate broadsheets have all got unmistakable commentary. Assault on America, doomsday America, as I say, declaration of war. This is being taken incredibly seriously, as you can imagine here. Commentators have been talking about it for the last 2 days, and leaders have been stepping up one by one across Europe and indeed across the world to offer sympathy, solidarity and support. There have been national security meetings in virtually every European capital, in Russia and in other places around the world, and there have been very practical steps taken, for instance, by NATO. 19 NATO representatives today in Brussels, in Belgium, their headquarters, invoked a Cold War era treaty in which essentially an attack on one member is an attack on all members, and all members are therefore committed to a mutual defense. They have said that this now they have taken, and if the United States decides that it wants to and needs to take action, then NATO is at its disposal to help in that situation. Apart from that, on a human level, there have been many people across Europe who've simply come to U.S. embassies, who've put flowers, sometimes even soft toys, who've left messages. Flags have been flying at half-staff at government buildings, certainly in Britain and in other parts of Europe and around the world. There have also been many messages of support from Arab countries, particularly the American Arab allies. They have condemned this act of terrorism, and also the 57 nations of the Organization of the Islamic Conference condemn this, saying that this is against Islam. There have been incidences which have, quote, sickened some people who've been watching, and those are the celebrations. Very few of these, we must stress, in some parts of the world, notably in refugee camps, in the Palestinian refugee camps in Lebanon and other parts where people have been celebrating this. Also in Iraq, which, as you know, is still in a state of low-level war with the United States, there have been support for this terrorist attack. This is not just the single greatest attack on the United States since World War II, but the single biggest act of terrorism anywhere in recorded memory. And that is really being felt, and a profound sense of confidence has been shaken, a sense of insecurity is settling down. And people in Britain who I've been talking to say that, look, you know, of a certain generation, we grew up with the Blitz. We know what it is to be bombed, to see destroyed buildings. But when we saw what happened in New York, we felt sick. We've never felt like this before.
Christian, I want to touch on something. I was just interviewing Bill Bennett, who's been very much a leader in the conservative movement in this country, former cabinet secretary. He and others are calling for striking back and striking hard. There were a number of columns in America's newspapers today calling on the administration not to hold back, not to wait. Based on what you know, the people you've been talking with, whether in London or elsewhere, what do you think the support would be if the United States decided to move quickly before all the facts were in? What do you think the reaction would be? Is there a threshold, I guess is what I'm asking, that people expect the United States to have of information before it moves?
Well, first of all, the Prime Minister of Britain, Tony Blair, and Britain is, of course, America's staunchest and closest ally in Europe, has basically said that an attack on the United States is an attack on the rest of the civilized world, on the rest of the democratic world. He said that this means that we are all targets, that no one is immune, and therefore all countries have to unite in a front, a united front, against this kind of what he called evil. He said that everybody has to unite. And he also said that Britain's interests were clearly engaged, because he predicted that there would be hundreds of British casualties. Many, many Britons live and work in the United States, as do many nationals from other countries. All this to say that groundwork appears to be being laid for some kind of response. I believe they think that it is inevitable if the United States comes to a conclusion that it has identified the perpetrators and can do something. On the other hand, there are people who say that while they do believe some kind of response has to be taken, they don't want to see the same kind of attack that happened in 1998 when cruise missiles were sent to Afghanistan and Sudan, and when several, innocent people, they say, were killed. There is a certain sense of carefulness here being taken. What's going to be interesting is whether this administration sends out Secretary of State Colin Powell to coalition build. This is the members of this administration have done this before. Colin Powell, Vice President Cheney, these people were in the first Bush administration and know what it is to build a coalition. And it's going to be interesting, and many people here are waiting to see whether that will be a next step, not just amongst allies, but like in the Gulf War, other nations to basically take sides. They're saying it is a time now to take sides and take a stand and stand up and be counted.
All right, Christian Amanpour reporting from London, and also reflecting what we're hearing here. Some saying, yes, move fast, but don't stoop to do what the terrorists have done to the United States. Now we want to go quickly to New York City, to CNN's John Voss at the scene in Lower Manhattan of this shaky building at 1 Liberty Plaza. John?
Judy, we're a few blocks away from the World Trade Center. All day we've been speaking with some workers as they finish their work on the debris, on their searching mission, looking for survivors, looking for bodies. A few that have stopped and have talked with us have told us some stories. One of the stories that we were told was how an American flag was found in the debris, how the workers stopped. They hoisted that flag upon a cell phone tower which once stood upon the top of the South Tower. They hoisted that flag. Everyone stopped momentarily. They saluted that flag. They said it gave everyone a much-needed morale boost. Other stories come from people from North Carolina who simply got in their cars, drove here, and tried to help. They say they were working in the cafeteria. They tell us they have found uneaten food. They have found laptops. They have found cell phones, which are still charged. Those same workers told us that when they look out of the cafeteria, they look upon that pile of rubble, and they tell us that whenever a body is found or a body part is found, it's marked by a piece of orange plastic, and they say that it seems as if there is orange plastic every 10 feet. And they do tell us, though, that when a body is found or a body part is found, it is treated with incredible respect. Other workers have told us that the fires, which are still burning, are setting off the ammunition which we assume was in the guns of the police officers, which are buried in that rubble. Other workers tell us it's been an extremely frustrating day. Debris is still falling there, and that every time that debris falls, work must stop. They must evacuate the area. They must stop, however briefly.
John, we're going to interrupt you now. John Voss, we're going to interrupt you now because we do want to take our viewers to the Capitol, where a prayer vigil, prayer service has just gotten underway.
Under the shadow of your throne, still we dwell secure. Sufficient is your love alone, and our defense is sure. We come together to affirm our faith in God as the sovereign of this land, and also the Lord of our lives. We come with heavy hearts, filled with a profound grief for our fellow Americans who have perished in the terrorist attack in New York City at the World Trade Center and here in Washington at the Pentagon. With deep love and care, we reach out to the families of these who were the victims of these attacks. And here we gather in this historic rotunda as the Congress of the United States to affirm our oneness in patriotism and our belief in Almighty God. Our help is in the name of the Lord, who made heaven and who made earth. Let us pray. O gracious Father, loving God, you have promised to keep us in perfect peace when our minds are stayed on you. Do for us what we cannot do for ourselves. Keep our minds on you. Lift up our hearts. Invade our thinking with your peace, your shalom, the peace that passes all understanding, the peace that places a balm of healing on our raw nerves, the peace that makes us secure in your everlasting arms. You alone can heal the immense grief following yesterday's tragic loss. You alone are the source of comfort for the immense pain, the loneliness, and the anguish that the families of the victims of yesterday's terrorist attacks have suffered and will endure. O blessed God, be the unseen but powerful presence in their homes, the strength of their spouses, the eternal Father to the fatherless children, a friend to those whose friends have perished in violent death. Mend their broken hearts, and fill them with courage. But now, Lord, thank you for the memory of those gallant police officers and firefighters who gave their lives to protect others. May we never forget their heroism and commitment. As members and officers of the Senate and the House of Representatives of Congress, we intercede for your care for their families. Strengthen them and give them an assurance of your presence. May they know that death came as no conqueror in the end. You met them as your eternal friend. Now in this memorial service, fill our hearts with hope and an assurance that death is not an ending, but a transition in eternal life. You are our Lord and our Savior. Amen. And now there will be the presentation of the colors, the Star-Spangled Banner, the Pledge of Allegiance, and the retiring of the colors.
in the saying of the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
A great psalm of comfort and courage is the 46th Psalm. It gives us personal hope and reassures our nation that God is in charge. Hear God's word. God is our refuge and our strength, a very present help in trouble. Therefore we will not fear. Even though the earth be removed, and though the mountains be carried into the midst of the sea, though its waters roar and be troubled, though the mountains shake with its swelling, there is a river whose streams make glad the city of God, the holy place of the tabernacle of the Most High. God is in the midst of her. She shall not be moved. God shall help her. The Lord of hosts is with us. The God of Jacob is our refuge. He makes wars to cease to the ends of the earth. He breaks the bow and cuts the spear in two. He burns the chariot with fire. Be still and know that I am God. I will be exalted among the nations. I will be exalted on the earth. The God of Jacob is our refuge. The Lord is with us. The word of the Lord. Amen.
What happened at the World Trade Center and the Pentagon yesterday is unreal. It is shocking. It is unbelievable. But it did happen. We stand together tonight, not as Democrats or Republicans, but as citizens of the world, as Americans, as brothers and sisters with pain and with hurt. We are a circle of trust that cannot be broken. We are one people. We are one family. We are one nation. Tonight we pray for those who are not here to pray for themselves. Let us all bow our heads in prayer. Oh God, we come to Thee tonight with heavy hearts. We need You now. We call on You because we know that You are a powerful and mighty God. We need You in this hour. We need Your healing power. We ask tonight for You to look down on us. Please, God, look down on America. Look down on New York. Look down on Washington. We ask Your blessing be upon the President of the United States, the leaders of the Congress, and all of the members. God, if You will, bless all of our people. We ask, oh God, in a very special way for You to be with the families and the loved ones of the victims at the World Trade Center and the Pentagon, and with the families of those who perished in Pennsylvania. We pray tonight for the firefighters the police officers, the doctors, the nurses, and all of the emergency medical personnel. We pray, O Lord, for our entire nation in this time of tremendous grief and despair. We call on you tonight, dear Lord, because there's no one else for us to call on. We turn to you tonight, for there's no one else for us to turn to in our hour of need. We ask that you continue to watch over America and shed thy grace on thee. We need thy help, O God, now, right now, more than ever before. Hear our prayer. We stand in need of your presence, O God. We are your people. We are your children. We are hurting. Our people are hurting. Our nation is hurting. Help us, O God. See us through this storm and hold us in the palm of your powerful hands. Tonight, dear God, let there be peace in our world, peace in America, and peace in our hearts and soul. Oh God, we just want to do your will. Give us the strength. Give us the courage to be faithful to your calling. This is our quest. This is our plea. This is our hope. Oh God, this is our prayer. Amen.
At 4 a.m. this morning, I was awakened by the stench of smoke from the fire still burning a mile away at the Pentagon. It made me feel sick and powerless, a feeling shared by many today. Only by turning to God Almighty will we have the wisdom and the strength we need in this great trial. Without God's Spirit dwelling within us, we are powerless. It is He from whom we derive all strength to console, to endure, to overcome evil, and to maintain our humanity in the faith of unfathomable inhumanity. And how do we gain this power? Only by asking God for His help. By opening our hearts can we receive God's grace and His all-powerful Spirit. God spoke in Jeremiah, "Call to me, and I will answer you, and show you great and mighty things which you do not know." God can show us the way, if we will but ask. We cannot explain what's happened. We don't have that capacity. Then how can we console those who've suffered so much through the loss of friends and loved ones? Yes, our hearts go out to them, but it's not enough for them or for us. The message again is to turn to God. He alone has the answers. In Isaiah, God assured us, "Fear not, I am with you. Be not dismayed, for I am your God. I will strengthen you. Yes, I will help you. I will uphold you with my righteous right hand." Tonight, let us open our hearts so that Almighty God may dwell within us, so that our actions are His actions. And let us believe in Him, so that our dismay is replaced by His strength. God loves us and is willing to help us. It is but for us to ask. May God bless us all.
Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now am found. Was blind, but now I see. 'Twas grace that taught my heart to fear, and grace my fears relieved. How precious did that grace appear the hour I first believed. Through many dangers, toils, and snares, we have already come, and the grace that brought us safe thus far, and grace will lead us home.
A reading from the book of Revelations. I saw a new heaven and a new earth. The former heaven and the former earth had passed away, and the sea was no more. I also saw the holy city coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride adorned for her husband. I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, "Behold, God's dwelling is with the human race. He will dwell with them, and they will be His people, and God Himself will always be with them as their God. He will wipe every tear from their eyes, and there will be no more death or mourning, wailing or pain, for the old order has passed away." The one who sat on the throne said, "Behold, I make all things new. I am the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end. To the thirsty I will give a gift from the spring of life-giving water. The victor will inherit these gifts, and I will be their God, and they will be my people."
Good evening. I'm so glad we could be together tonight. Our congressional family, the members of Congress, our spouses, that we could come together and really ask God's blessing on us now at this time of great trouble and travail in our country, and how like us as the American people to come together and put aside our differences and really turn to a higher power to bless us and bless all who are in need. What happened yesterday was not only an attack against America, it was a crime against democracy. It was a crime against decency. It was a crime against humanity. And we need God in our lives, and we need to ask God's blessing. We need to open up our hearts now to all who are in need. Let's tonight ask for God's blessings on all who are suffering unutterable grief and pain. Dear God, please bless the many who lost their lives. Dear God, bring your healing powers to the thousands who are injured and suffering, and bring fortitude to the families of all of the victims. Dear God, bring down your guardian angels right this minute to the rescue workers and the medical personnel who are working around the clock to try to save lives and to try those who are finding lives. Dear God, we need your help. Our hearts and prayers also go out to members of our own Senate family who are feeling this in a very deep and personal way. Our two colleagues from New York who are in the city this evening, as well as to our senators from Connecticut and New Jersey and what they feel. To the senators from Virginia and to my own colleague from Maryland, we lost people at the Pentagon. Our minds are seared today with images we can still scarcely comprehend. For me, one of the most terrible of those images was the sight of thick smoke over Arlington Cemetery. I couldn't believe it. The graves in that hallowed ground remind us that Americans have faced great evil before, and you know what? We've defeated it. We are united in our resolve to do it again. The question I think all of us are facing is, why are good, innocent people allowed to suffer? This question is as old as humanity. It was the cry of Job, and it's the question that haunts us today. I don't know the answer, but I want to share with you a passage from the book of Job. Job says this: "The thing which I feared greatly has come upon me. That which I was afraid has come to me. Today, what we have feared has come to our land." But again, like Job, we know that the grace of God can lead us to do the right thing. We ask God for the courage and the wisdom to respond rightly. I believe that God was with the victims of yesterday's attack. I believe God was with them in their hour of travail, fear, and death. I believe He is here with all of those who grieve and all those who suffer with these so many good and innocent people. And I believe He will be with us in our search for answers and justice. That's my prayer this evening. We're not going to sacrifice our ideals in the pursuit of the monsters who attacked us. We're not going to compromise our principles for which so many Americans fought and died. But we will root out those who committed this atrocity. We will pursue justice. And with God's grace, we're going to move forward. We're going to be a stronger nation and a better people than before. So let's again ask for God's mercy. Let's ask for God's forgiveness upon those who did this terrible deed and that they might repent and turn to a different life. And let us then try to find what is the good and righteous thing to do. God bless you, and God bless America.
As we watch this prayer vigil at the United States Capitol for members of Congress and their spouses, I'm Judy Woodruff in Washington. I'm going to say goodnight for now, but in just a moment, Wolf Blitzer, Greta Van Susteren will be with us as our coverage continues of the attack on America.
Tonight, America under attack. How could it happen? 4 airliners take off from 3 airports within a 12-minute span. All have hijackers aboard.
A number of the suspected hijackers were trained as pilots in the United States.
3 planes are used for suicide attacks. 1 does not find its objective. We'll take a close look at just what happened aboard those planes. Meticulous planning, plenty of resources, deadly will. Who did it? How did they do it? And why? We'll speak live with Senators John McCain and Richard Shelby, former New York Police Commissioner Ray Kelly, former CIA Director Jim Woolsey, and other top intelligence and law enforcement authorities. And as investigators begin casting their net, we'll go live to our CNN correspondents on the scene to find out what happens next.
Blitzer reporting tonight from Washington. Behind me, the White House, the Washington Monument, and a short distance away, just across the Potomac River, the Pentagon. Symbols of a country which has now come under attack.
And I'm Greta Van Susteren. On this day after, how did it happen? How could it have happened? We'll do our best to answer those 2 questions.
For those of you who are just joining us, here's a quick update on the developments at this hour. Another building adjacent to New York's World Trade Center has partially collapsed. The 54-story One Liberty Plaza building was the new home of the NASDAQ Stock Exchange. Rescue workers combing the wreckage of the Trade Center's twin towers were evacuated. Earlier, they had pulled 9 people alive from the rubble. At the Pentagon, parts of which are still smoldering, firefighters showed their courage and their colors, and the president paid a visit.
Coming here makes me sad on the one hand. It also makes me angry. And our country will, however, not be cowed by terrorists, by people who don't share the same values we share, by people who are willing to destroy people's lives.
Boston, where 2 of the hijacked flights originated, is a focus of the investigation. Police and FBI agents swarmed a downtown hotel, and a car containing suspicious materials was impounded at Logan Airport. A number of people have been taken into custody, several of them in Florida, where authorities zeroed in on aviation schools and a home where one of the suspected hijackers may have lived. For more on the developments in Boston, let's go to CNN's Boston Bureau Chief Bill Delaney. Bill, tell us what we know right now.
Well, Wolf, to give you an idea of the sheer dimensions of the investigations here, 150 state police detectives assigned to investigate Logan Airport alone, among hundreds of FBI, state, and local police who are fanning out for whatever evidence they can garner and talking now to people who have been taken into custody. 3 people taken into custody at Boston's Westin Copley Hotel today in extraordinary scenes in Copley Square in the heart of Boston. Usually a place people sit around and look at fountains and pigeons. Today, FBI SWAT teams, heavily armed with machine guns, storming into the Westin Copley Hotel where they took into custody 3 men. Now, FBI Director Robert Mueller himself being careful to point out that these were not arrests. These men have been brought in for questioning, for possible links, for possible information as sources to try to understand who committed the hijackings that left Boston, the 2 planes that crashed into the World Trade Center. Now, after the arrests, bomb-sniffing dogs made what authorities call a hit in the Boston Westin Hotel. It was at that point that the hotel and a nearby shopping mall were evacuated, adding thousands into an already extraordinary scene in Copley Square where thousands of onlookers had already gathered. Now thousands came out, evacuated from those hotels in mostly calm scenes. Now it's being widely reported and sourced as well by CNN sources that the hijackers who came to Boston came from two places, from two directions. One team from Canada. Now, a car at Portland International Airport has become a focus for state police there. They believe that was a car used by at least one of the hijackers. Another car is here in Boston. Now, this was taken into custody at Central Parking here yesterday. It's now at an FBI processing center near Boston, and this a very important piece of evidence apparently indeed. Arabic language flight training manuals reportedly found in that car, and CNN's Mike Betcher reporting earlier that the car was registered to two Arabs. Back to you, Wolf.
Well, Delaney, very briefly, do we know when Boston's Logan Airport will reopen?
Closed indefinitely while officials here try to work with those FAA guidelines that have been imposed on airports around the country. It's closed indefinitely.
Okay, Bill Delaney in Boston, thank you very much. Greta?
The investigation into the attacks is literally spanning the globe, with hundreds of agents and law enforcement agencies involved and new leads developing by the hour. For a look at the big picture, let's go now to CNN's justice correspondent Kelly Arena in Washington. Kelly, give me an idea, big picture, how many people are involved in this investigation?
The FBI says they have 4,000 special agents, 3,000 support personnel. That's not to mention the hundreds of people that work in the FBI labs working on this investigation around the nation. And they are pursuing, at last count, more than 2,000 leads.
Now, when you talk about this investigation, a number of crime scenes, you've got Boston, you've got Newark, you've got Pennsylvania. Let me go through the different crime scenes and tell me what's going on. In Boston, what kind of investigation are they doing at the airport?
Well, at all of those locations, Greta, what the FBI has done, has identified the takeoff sites, not only the airports themselves, but the surrounding areas, and then the crash sites as crime scenes. And at those locations, what they're doing is they're dusting for fingerprints. They are going through passenger manifests, rental car records. They're looking at telephone logs, videotape from parking garages, looking at payphone videotapes. And we were even told by some law enforcement sources that investigators in Florida, for example, are going through neighborhoods and restaurants showing people pictures of suspected hijackers. So they're really pounding the pavement and trying to gather as much forensic evidence as possible.
And the crash site in Pennsylvania, is that getting closer examination? Because at least the plane at least has a chance of more parts there.
Well, exactly. I mean, in Pennsylvania, that was the only plane that went into the ground instead of into a building, so they have a much better chance of getting at it and really trying to get some information. Plus, law enforcement sources also tell CNN that the transponder on that plane was open for a period on that flight, so they may have information, at least air traffic control may have information directly from the cockpit on that flight. And as you know, Greta, we also have people who have called from not only the Pennsylvania flight but others, but specifically from Pennsylvania. We've heard from family members that have outlined the tragedy that went on that flight.
Kelly Arena, thank you for joining me tonight. Wolf?
World Trade Center and the Pentagon, quote, acts of war, and officials now say the White House itself was an intended target. Let's go live to CNN senior White House correspondent John King. So obviously at the White House. John, tell us what we know about that.
Well, Wolf, to put this new information in context, let's think back to yesterday morning when the first pictures were being shown of those planes hitting the World Trade Center. We saw an evacuation here at the White House. CNN is also told now by sources that Vice President Dick Cheney, National Security Advisor Condoleezza Rice, other top White House officials were ushered out of their offices to a command and control bunker, a fortified command and control bunker deep beneath the White House grounds here. Why? Administration officials now saying that that plane that came across the Potomac River caused so much damage across the river at the Pentagon. Its initial target, we are now told, might not have been the Pentagon.
We have real and credible information that the airplane that landed at the Pentagon was originally intended to hit the White House.
Can you tell us about the nature of that evidence?
No, of course I cannot. Any questions relating to how we have obtained any of this information, sources and methods, I will of course not answer.
Why it changed course, or why it went to the Pentagon and not the White House?
We really do not know the answer to that.
Administration officials also saying not just the White House, but in their view, they also believe that Air Force One, the president's jet, was a target for the terrorists. That, they say, the reason the president did not fly directly back to Washington from Sarasota, Florida. You will remember he stopped first at a military installation in Louisiana, then a military installation in Nebraska. Only then did the president return to Washington with an extraordinary fighter escort visible to those flying aboard Air Force One. The administration saying it believed Air Force One was a target as well. Some sources even saying they believe that plane that crashed outside of Pittsburgh was planning to turn south and bank its way toward Washington and, if possible, emphasis on if possible, collide with Air Force One as the president was returning to Washington. Wolf.
John, pretty amazing stuff. The president did meet with his national security team once again today. Do we know anything at all about a timetable for a possible U.S. military response?
We know nothing specific about a timetable except the public words of the President and the Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld, both saying to be patient, that fighting terrorism will not come in a day or two. But we do know, Wolf, from sources familiar with those discussions, the President met twice with his national security team today, and we are told that among the items discussed were possible U.S. military options. We're told, though, these discussions are in their earliest stages. The priority right now for the administration, building broad diplomatic support. The President spoke today to a half-dozen international leaders, including the presidents of China and Russia, and the administration very much welcoming NATO's statement that these terrorist attacks on the United States, in the view of NATO, are attacks on the NATO alliance. So the President promising there will be consequences to this, but also saying it might take some time.
John King at the White House, thank you very much. Back to you, Greta.
New information, Wolf, is emerging about what happened aboard those 4 hijacked planes before they were brought down. Information which may shed light on what the passengers and the crew were doing and may help reveal who carried out the attacks and why. More from CNN's Miles O'Brien.
Nothing seemed amiss when American Airlines Flight 11 left the runway in Boston Tuesday morning. The 767-200 was about half full, toting 81 passengers, a cockpit crew of 2, and 9 flight attendants to the opposite coast. The captain likely planned for a 5-hour flight, so there was roughly 8,500 gallons of jet fuel in its 3 tanks. FAA radars tracked the airliner as it followed the flight plan. But then, about 20 minutes into the flight, somewhere over upstate New York, it turned sharply to the south. Flight 11 was hijacked, apparently by knife-wielding men. Airline pilots are trained to handle such situations by keeping calm, complying with requests, and, if possible, dialing in an emergency 4-digit code on a device called a transponder. It transmits crucial flight data to air traffic controllers. The action takes seconds, but it appears no such code was entered. But in the cabin, a frantic flight attendant managed to use a phone to call American Airlines Command Center in Dallas. She reported the trouble, and according to the Christian Science Monitor, a pilot apparently keyed the microphone, transmitting a cockpit conversation. The hijackers could be heard saying, "We have more planes, we have more planes." Radio transmissions like this would have been recorded on the ground by the FAA.
The police have identified 5 suspects that they believe were involved with this terrorist act, and 2 of whom may be brothers, apparently, reportedly. 2 of whom, 2 others, may have flown in from Portland and originated in Canada.
About 5 minutes before Flight 11 started heading south, another 767, United Flight 175, left Boston, also for Los Angeles, 65 souls aboard. 15 minutes after becoming airborne, it veered off course. One passenger made 2 calls to his father. In one exchange, he said a flight attendant was stabbed. In the second call, he told his dad the plane was going down.
They knew not to carry guns on the airplane. If they fired off a bullet, they could have had explosive decompression on the aircraft. They knew what they were doing, and they knew what their mission was, obviously.
We know what happened next. The 767 struck and ultimately leveled the World Trade Center's Twin Towers.
I know pilots. No, if you're going to die, you're not going to fly in a World Trade Center to do it. Yeah, there would be a struggle, major struggle.
By 8:20, the third hijacked flight, American Flight 77, a 757, left Dulles Airport outside Washington, again bound for Los Angeles with 66 people on board. Radar tracking information on this flight obtained by CNN seems to indicate the transponder was turned off, which would have made it tougher to see on radar. We do know this. An hour and 20 minutes after departure, it plowed into the Pentagon. On board was Barbara Olson, a well-known attorney and frequent CNN legal commentator. Huddled in the back of the plane, Olson called her husband twice from her cell phone. She described the frantic scene.
She said that they were armed with knives and box cutters, cardboard cutters.
Even as the focus shifted to the nation's capital, a fourth plane, United Airlines Flight 93, bound for San Francisco out of Newark, takes a sudden 180-degree turn near Cleveland. More than one of the 38 passengers called their families to offer final goodbyes.
He said, I want you to know I love you very much, and I'm calling you from the plane. We've been taken over. There are 3 men that say they have a bomb. And then the phone went dead.
The 757 began homing in on the Washington area, its target unknown. But this flight did not make it that far. It crashed into a cornfield in Somerset County, Pennsylvania. Was there a struggle in this cockpit? The military denies it was shot down. Pilots assessing this horrific sequence of events to a person believe the hijackers were in control of the 3 planes that hit their targets and that they must have been well schooled in aviation.
No, these people were well qualified on the airplane. They knew the systems, they knew the navigation, and they knew the flight management system, the computers, and they knew navigation. I mean, they went from Boston and right down to New York. I mean, they had to know which way to turn.
Miles O'Brien, CNN.
And with investigators turning much of their attention to Boston, let's turn now to Boston Herald reporter Jonathan Wells, who's been tracking the hijacking probe. He joins us, as we just saw, from our Boston bureau. Jonathan, what do we know about how these hijackers managed to board these 2 planes at Logan Airport in Boston?
Well, that part of the story is really yet to come out, how they actually got on the planes, other than apparently their purchase of 7 of the tickets that were used for the 2 flights were purchased with a credit card, a common credit card, which helped the FBI detain 3 individuals at the Westin Hotel today in Boston who are apparently associates of the hijackers. But how they actually get on the plane, the mechanics of that, I don't know.
And what do you know, if anything, about their whereabouts just before they got to Boston? Had they been in Boston for some time, or did they get there only just before the flights?
Well, here's what we understand. At least 2 of the hijackers apparently came down from Canada, we believe through Nova Scotia, boarded a ferry to Maine. From Maine, either getting off at Bar Harbor or Portland, Maine. They then eventually ended up on a flight to Boston. Now, there apparently may be other hijackers that entered through Canada by a different route, possibly by car. Overall, what we've learned is that a terrorist cell was apparently operating in Massachusetts, had its members traveling to Canada at various times, it appears, had been operating in Massachusetts for some time leading up to this. We've heard mention of Springfield and Western Mass as a post for some of these people. And essentially, they were able to hatch this plot in Massachusetts to some extent and use Massachusetts as a staging area for the attack on New York.
Jonathan Wells of the Boston Herald, thank you very much for joining us. And there is a widespread belief that yesterday's attack succeeded because of major security and intelligence failures. Joining us now, the former CIA Director Jim Woolsey, Larry Johnson, he's a former State Department counterterrorism official, and Senator Richard Shelby, he's the ranking Republican on the Senate Intelligence Committee. Gentlemen, thanks for joining us. Senator Shelby, tell us, first of all, what do we know right now? What do you know right now about who may have been responsible for these attacks?
Well, this investigation, as you know, is ongoing. I was in a briefing with the Attorney General and the FBI Director earlier this afternoon. I won't comment on that. But I can tell you, Wolf, I said last night, I've said it again today, there are certain parallels, I believe, between what happened yesterday in some sense with what happened to our embassies in Africa 3 years ago. Think of the timing. The first thing that came to my mind was the parallel between the precise timings of these bombings. In this case, it was the airplanes, but timing's important. Timing's always been important to Osama bin Laden and his group. Now, was it Osama bin Laden or was it some similar cells? We'll wait for the investigation. I got a belief it's linked.
Director Woolsey, a lot of people say that the signature of Osama bin Laden is all over these attacks. Are you ready to draw that conclusion?
It may be all over these attacks, and I think that might make us a bit suspicious that something else may be up. Certainly, bin Laden may well have been deeply involved and may have been the operational figure and his people in this, but that doesn't mean that he acted alone. When I see bin Laden issuing fatwas, religious edicts, putting out videotapes, issuing poems, having his subordinates talk about how they're taking part in terrorism against the United States, I begin to think that maybe we're supposed to focus solely on bin Laden, and there might be something else in train. My suspicion, it's no more than that at this point, is that there could be some government action involved together with bin Laden or a major terrorist group, and one strong suspect there, I think, would be the government of Iraq.
Larry Johnson, the government of Iraq sponsoring this act of terrorism, is that your sense as well?
No, I think that's highly unlikely for several reasons. Principally, Iraq right now has been winning the political battle against the United States in the effort to lift sanctions. Secondly, the only recorded terrorist attack we have by Iraq against the United States was the attempt in February of 1993 to kill then former President George Bush Sr. Saddam is a lot of things, but he's not crazy. And the motivations for him at this point to launch an attack that's not just killing Americans, but has probably killed people from as many as 40 different nations in the World Trade Center, which would turn the world against him at a time when he's been making progress in the United Nations and getting sanctions lifted. I think, we should not ascribe to him that kind of idiocy.
So let me just move on to Senator Shelby, Larry Johnson, but before I do, very, very quickly, if it's not Iraq, is it your sense it is just Osama bin Laden?
The only person over the last 8 years, the one that we know for sure that has killed the majority of Americans in terrorist attacks is Osama bin Laden and groups linked to him. And that's not a matter of opinion now. We have that as a result of the U.S. Embassy bombing trials from East Africa earlier this year. Moreover, and one final point, in that trial, evidence emerged that demonstrated that Osama bin Laden had had prior meetings and contacts with Imad Mughniyeh, the Hezbollah chief who was involved with the bombing of the Marine barracks, bombings of U.S. embassies, hijackings of airplanes. And the reason he wants to emulate Mughniyeh is because Mughniyeh succeeded in driving the United States out of Lebanon.
All right, Senator Shelby, you're the ranking Republican, the ranking member of the Senate Intelligence Committee, the former immediate past chairman. I want to read to you a line from what William Safire, the New York Times columnist, wrote today. He said this: "The next attack will probably not be by a hijacked jet, for which we will belatedly prepare. More likely, it will be a terrorist-purchased nuclear missile or a barrel of deadly germs dumped in a city's reservoir." That's pretty alarming kind of stuff. Is it far-fetched?
I don't think anything's far-fetched. We've been trying to prepare for weapons of mass destruction. On the Intelligence Committee, I, Senator Graham, and others have tried to alert the American people to that. We have training to deal with terrorists now, the first responder program, people that would destroy our water supplies, do other things. I think it would probably come in a chemical attack first, but that's just my hunch.
Director Woolsey, yesterday I spoke to Paul Bremer, former State Department and ambassador for counterterrorism. He made the point that in 1995, the CIA effectively stopped recruiting agents in some of these terrorist cells, perhaps out of concern that Congress wouldn't like the fact that they were putting on the U.S. government's payroll some sordid, very nasty figures, and that could have undermined human intelligence gathering capabilities by the United States. Is that a fair point he makes?
Jerry and I very much agree on that. He chaired the Commission on Terrorism that I served on. This is some guidelines that were put out a few months after I stepped down as director. They grew out of the Jennifer Harbury Bamako mess in Guatemala. And the upshot is that the CIA has guidelines now that don't block it from recruiting people with violent backgrounds as spies, but they do somewhat deter it and inhibit it. And, you know, there are a lot of good people trapped inside bad governments who want to work for the United States, and that might be one way that is one way we get spies who help us in governments. But inside bin Laden's organization, or Hezbollah, there are only people who want to be human rights violators. So if you don't recruit human rights violators, you don't recruit people inside terrorist organizations. And I think Jerry is on the right track with that. I think those guidelines, particularly with respect to terrorist recruitments, ought to be changed.
So by all accounts, therefore, Larry Johnson, would you characterize this failure, this is an intelligence failure, these 4 attacks, these 4 hijackings yesterday, and the devastation that resulted from them?
In one sense, but this is not to assign blame. What really is going on here is the CIA is set up and structured much like the U.S. cavalry was before World War II. Horses had no place in World War II, yet it was still a part of the Army. And unfortunately, most of our intelligence apparatus overseas is structured to still deal with the Cold War. And there have been efforts to change it. But, and again, I'm basing this upon, I've got several friends who are in senior positions as case officers. The morale is terrible. There is a risk-averse culture, and Director Woolsey put his finger on it. These folks are just not able to penetrate what they need to, because we as this country, we can't decide whether we want to kill the rats who are in the sewer, but we don't want to get into the sewer. So therefore, we want to stay out of the sewer, but we want the rats dead, and we've got to make a choice at some point.
Senator Shelby, you'll have the last word. How do you resolve that dilemma that Larry Johnson and Director Woolsey just spoke about?
Well, I think we're going to have to beef up all aspects and change a lot of the structure and the environment in our intelligence agency. We've been talking about that. I want to talk about just one second. I believe it was not a success yesterday for our intelligence agencies. If it was not a success, it was a failure. Now, I'm not here to put blame on anybody, because there have been many successes, but we have to start with where we are. We had a terrible situation yesterday. We will have it again unless we eradicate terrorism. We got to do it. We can do it, but only with resolve.
Okay, I want to thank all 3 of you, Jim Woolsey, Larry Johnson, Senator Shelby. Thanks for your insight on these remarkable hours as they go by. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And updating once again the latest developments at this hour. A 54-story building across the street from New York's World Trade Center has partially collapsed. Rescue crews working in the ruins of the Twin Towers were evacuated before the building at 1 Liberty Plaza began to fall. 9 people have been pulled alive from the rubble of yesterday's attack. While some workers were back on the job at the Pentagon today, fire and rescue crews are finding it tough to make much headway in still smoldering ruins. One way the country is reacting to the devastation and horrific casualties is through prayer. There was a gathering in Dallas today, and a vigil has been underway at the U.S. Capitol. The investigation into the attacks has led authorities to several parts of the United States. Boston, where 2 of the hijacked planes originated, has been a focus of their efforts. A number of people have been detained for questioning. Greta?
Well, for some more insight into the massive task investigators are facing, we're joined by Bill Hinshaw at CNN Center in Atlanta. He's a former special agent with the FBI and a veteran of many bombing and hijacking investigations. And from New York, former City Police Commissioner Ray Kelly. Welcome to both of you. Bill, first to you. How do you get knives and box cutters on airplanes? In fact, on 4 different airplanes within about an hour and a half.
Well, I think it was pretty well planned, and it's relatively easy, or was relatively easy, because I think the focus of the interdiction was against weapons and explosives, and not against knives or screwdrivers or box cutters.
But you know, Bill, you still got to get through security, and every time I go through security, I go through, my body goes through the metal detector, and my carry-on baggage goes through the machine. Isn't anybody looking?
I've gotten on the plane with Swiss Army knives. I've got on the last flight I was on was behind a guy that had a toolbox that had a number of fancy-looking tools, but among them was a box cutter and several long screwdrivers. So I think the whole focus was not on what the hijackers used.
Ray, do you think the questions, have you packed your own bags and have your luggage been with you since you packed them? Are those questions simply of no value?
Yeah, I think they're of no value. I think they're silly. If you remember when we first started these magnetometers and checking people in, we used law enforcement personnel to do that. We've gotten away from that for a long time. We now use people who try hard, but certainly the standards are not very high. There's tremendous turnover. That's something that I believe has to change right now in the near term. It's just it's a silly exercise.
It was a pleasure. Ray, what do you make of the fact that they were able to get knives and box cutters? I mean, it wasn't simply one slip, one person. I mean, this was a plan. 4 different flights had them.
Undoubtedly, it was a plan, and I'm sure it was practiced. It was something that they just didn't do for the first time. You know, if you look at the FAA tests that they do at virtually every major airport each year, some of the failure rates are as high as 80%. So it's an area that needs to be looked at and needs to be changed radically. It's drifted so much since the 70s when we first started these types of security checks.
You know, Bill, when I hear him say 80% failure, that apparently we've known there's an 80% failure in the security on these questions and getting weapons onto planes, I must admit I'm scandalized. I mean, is this what's been happening in our airports?
I suppose it has. That's what the tests show. But until we had an event such as this, it didn't really come to become a national event.
Ray, obviously the pilots of these planes have gone down, but there are a lot of people that may have helped these pilots commit this horrible crime. How do we find the others, the ones who may have helped a little bit and therefore are co-conspirators and just as responsible?
Well, you do the classic backtracking investigation, just what the FBI is doing now. You're checking rental car records, you're checking itinerary. I mean, we've seen it. We saw it in 1999 with Ahmad Rassam. We know that Canada is clearly an easy point of entry for people to come from places like the Middle East, get into Canada, and then come across our border. Last year, we had almost 500 million visitors into the United States. We need a much stronger border protection. We tried to get that in Congress after Ahmad Rassam came across in the millennium in 1999, and there was, quite frankly, no response. We need a much more robust examination of people coming into the United States. It hasn't changed, certainly in the last 2 years, and that was Rassam came in with 150 pounds of explosive and was headed for LAX. He was convicted. He also, by the way, pointed towards Osama bin Laden. So, I mean, more and more evidence is being accumulated that points to bin Laden as our major enemy in this area.
Bill, how easy to get into these cockpits?
Well, the last plane I was on, the cockpit door was open a good bit of the time. In the days a quarter of a century ago when we were facing the hijackings, or people were hijacking for money, they closed the cockpit door, and usually there was an armed sky marshal behind there, and nobody went in there, not even flight attendants. So,
but today, I mean, but obviously Ford did get in. Do you think it's extortion that they threaten the pilots? They're going to slit someone's throat or do something like that to get the pilots to open the doors?
I think they possibly could have, because my understanding is that the assumptions have always been don't do anything to make the hijackers mad. Let's get them on the ground. We'll negotiate with them, give them pizzas for passengers, and do something like that. These people obviously had an entirely different intent, and they didn't fit the profile, and we paid for it.
Ray, I've heard so often everyone say these are trained pilots, experienced pilots, and I do understand there's some reports saying that they had trained in Florida. But to fly a 757 or a 767, at least I would think, takes a significant amount of training, does it not?
Well, you know, these aircraft these days are fly-by-wire. They're computer controlled. You can get even simulator programs for computers. I think once it's up in the air, it's probably not that challenging, particularly if you've had some flight training. So I think it's probably easier than you might suspect.
What about aiming, though? They still wanted to hit targets. 3 of the planes were headed for targets.
Right, and I think obviously they had some training in that regard. But I mean, you talk to pilots, they say that it isn't that complicated. There is a lot of this, of course, is on automatic pilot. You get from one location to the other by going from point to point. You disengage that automatic pilot, then you do the aiming. Yes, it takes some training, but I'm told it doesn't take that much to be able to steer the aircraft.
All right, Bill Henshaw, Ray Kelly, thank you very much for joining us this evening.
Thank you.
The effort to identify the hijackers has led investigators to Florida, where they are questioning people and executing search warrants. CNN's Susan Candiati is in Vero Beach, Florida, with that part of the story. Susan?
Hello, Greta. Indeed, the FBI here in Florida had a very, very busy day indeed. We'll try to give you the highlights of what happened here this day and in other locations as well. First, we can report to you that the FBI indeed has leads on suspected hijackers that were involved in this terrorist attack. They are still hijackers who attended flight schools here in Florida. And at this hour, the FBI continues to look at other flight schools here in Florida. Law enforcement sources say that 2 of the suspected hijackers, at least 2 of them, lived here in Vero Beach. 2 of them are brothers that lived here. One of them lived on this very street. Both are described as Saudi citizens. One of them is Adnan Bukhari. Adnan Bukhari, we have a photograph of him. He is said to be in his 40s. He is described as a commercial pilot for Saudi Arabian Airlines. Also living in Vero Beach, Bukhari's brother Amir. Both lived here with their wives and children. Now, this afternoon, we also had a chance to go inside one of their rented homes. This is the one rented by Adnan Bukhari. It was searched this day by the FBI, and according to documents left behind by agents, they seized a number of items, including a computer software, U.S. immigration papers, bank receipts, phone cards, a flight safety bag. We also saw a pilot's certificate, as well as a certificate that they had received specialized instruction on multi-engine planes. These pilots, we are told by law enforcement sources, attended Flight Safety International, a flight school here in Vero Beach. Law enforcement sources also tell CNN that the Bukhari brothers were believed to have been on one of the 2 flights out of Boston, one of those 2 flights that wound up slamming into the World Trade Center. Also, we can report to you that a car impounded in Portland, Maine, according to law enforcement authorities, was rented at Boston Logan Airport and driven to Portland, Maine. Now, the Maine State Police confirmed that 2 of the suspected hijackers were on a U.S. air flight out of Logan Airport, again, one of the 2 planes that crashed into the World Trade Center. The FBI also looking at 2 more suspected hijackers who spent some time both in Venice, Florida, as well as Coral Springs, Florida, which is located in the south. The 2 are Mohammed Atta and Marwan Youssef al-Shahi. Now, they stayed for a few days at the home of Charlie Voss in Venice, Florida, and they took courses at Hoffman Aviation. These people both had passports from the United Arab Republic. And finally, we can tell you that at this hour at FBI headquarters in Miami, the FBI is interviewing someone they described as a witness or friend or associate of the suspected hijackers. Back to you, Greta.
Susan Candiati, thank you very much. Wolf, back to you.
Thank you very much, Greta. And the investigation is also moving forward on the international front tonight. CNN's Mike Betcher is tracking those developments. He joins us now from the CNN Center in Atlanta. What kind of leads, Mike, are you hearing about that point to Osama bin Laden?
Well, what they're doing is going back 2 years and going over all of the analysis they've had in this transformation of Al-Qaeda, which is the network run by Osama bin Laden. There are intercepts, and that has been talked about by officials in the government, SIGINT, as it's called, Signals Intelligence. But they're also going back with clues back for the last 2 years as Al-Qaeda has tried to transform itself, Wolf, trying to bring in various groups from other countries, especially from North Africa. They're taking a close look at Algerians as well, because it was an Algerian terrorist group, GIA, which tried to also perform a similar terrorist incident, ramming a hijacked airliner into the Eiffel Tower. That was unsuccessful, of course. That happened back in the mid-90s. It was thwarted. So they're casting their broad net, looking at what the information was over the past 2 years, Wolf, and they have gleaned a lot of evidence from that period.
And I know, Mike, you have a sort of a handbook that the Osama bin Laden organization, Al-Qaeda, circulated, which was intercepted. Tell us about some of the tips they have in there.
Well, this was introduced in the trial of the bombers of the African embassies in Tanzania and Kenya. It is an Al-Qaeda operations manual, and it dissects precisely small things. For example, what Susan was talking about on the air just a few moments ago, how to rent an apartment. Let me give you an example. In one section called Security Precautions Related to Apartments, it reads, providing the necessary cover for people who frequent the apartment, avoid seclusion and isolation from the population, and refraining from going to the apartment at suspicious times. And it is preferable to rent these apartments using false names, appropriate cover, and non-Muslim appearance. Now, if these suspected terrorists are part of Al-Qaeda, certainly this manual would have been part of the game plan, so to speak, Wolf, they would have followed.
Mike Boettcher, thank you very much. And let's get some historic perspective now on this tumultuous day and a half, the attack on America. How are we coping? What's likely ahead? Let's check in with CNN senior analyst Jeff Greenfield. He's in New York. Jeff, I was moved yesterday, Jeff, when you spoke about fear in America and how all of us probably will change our definition of that word as a result of what has happened.
I think that's right, Wolf. We have been a country blessed by two oceans, blessed by, except for the Civil War, never really having had violence on our soil, with the rare exception of Oklahoma City. I think if you were around New York today, it felt different than any other time I can remember. I took the subway down to work, as I always do. People were not just quiet, they were numb. Spoke to one of my old friends today who's a frequent world traveler, not going to Europe on his next planned trip, really uneasy about getting on an airplane. And that, I think, is the most significant question we face, whether this event really does, for a long period of time, fundamentally shake the security that we as Americans have always felt in our own country.
And there's no doubt even much more mundane matters will be rethought. For example, going up in a high-rise building. What were to happen if they rebuild the World Trade Center? A lot of people might be afraid to go up to the 90th floor.
Well, I think, in fact, that has already come up. There's this sense in New York that we must rebuild to show we will not be cowed by terrorists. That's a very noble sentiment. Who is going to want to work in that building? I myself, yesterday, Wolf, gazed a few blocks east at the Empire State Building, and for a couple of hours, I must say, I had a kind of uneasy feeling, is that the next target? And when you walk around like that, I mean, people who grew up in Europe, lived in Europe during World War II, they know what this means. But we as Americans don't know what this means. You spend a lot of time in Israel. You know they've come to, in some way, to live with that. And I do think that one of the real questions, I don't think we can possibly answer it for a long time to come, is whether there will be a long-term sense of uneasiness as for people who move around big cities, who get on an airplane, something we take for granted. I mean, Wolf, you and I both know that the biggest complaint we've had about airplanes is they never take off, and the trauma of airline travel. That seems like a relatively trivial matter right now, and I wonder whether that's going to affect, in some sense, our whole national sense that as Americans we've been protected.
And from what I hear you saying, and I certainly agree with you if I hear you right, this event will change all of our lives for perhaps forever.
I think, we are so given to overstatement in the media that I almost hesitate to put it that way, but I think you are right, Wolf. I think September 11th, 2001 is going to define an America before and after it every bit as much as December 7th, 1941 or November 22nd, 1963. I think it is not too much to say that we will not live anymore the same way we have been used to living before this event. And that is something that's it's so unusual for this country to go to it that I think we haven't begun to get our minds around what that means.
I totally agree. Jeff Greenfield in New York, thank you very much. Greta?
A war hero himself, he says his country is now at war again, saying this nation is in a state of controlled fury. He has a message for those behind the attacks. Senator John McCain joins us now live from Capitol Hill. Senator, thank you for joining us. You have said that we are at war, as well as the President of the United States earlier today said they were acts of war. Are we really at war? There's been no formal declaration, but are we at war?
Well, I don't think there's any doubt, Greta. Acts of war have been perpetrated on the United States of America by these terrorists, and they have declared war on the United States of America, and so I think it fits the criteria. Now, as far as a formal declaration of war on the part of the United States is concerned, that may be somewhat difficult in the respects that I'm not sure exactly how you do that, but I don't think there's any doubt that we are in a state of war.
In the event that we can identify the parties who have done these horrible tragedies on American soil, do you expect, or would you want the United States to declare formal war against the perpetrators?
Yes, I do, but I don't know exactly whether it fits the criteria for a declaration of war on the part of the Congress of the United States. Whether it is a statement that the President and the Congress make together about the nature of this conflict that we're in is something I think we have to worry about in more of a Talmudic fashion. But what we're really talking about is that the American people need to know this is a long, hard struggle. It wouldn't be over if we got rid of Mr. bin Laden tomorrow. There are other organizations that are bent on the destruction of the United States of America, and in order for us to preserve America and our way of life, we're going to have to sacrifice American treasure and, unfortunately, in some cases, perhaps some American blood.
Senator, have you had an opportunity to speak to the President about this?
I haven't spoken directly to the President. I've spoken to literally all the other administration officials.
Senator McCain, it's Wolf Blitzer. There's a new poll that just came out, an ABC News Washington Post poll, that suggests that all Americans may have to sacrifice something else. Look at these numbers. Would you be willing to give up some of your liberties in this country in order for the government to crack down on terrorism? 66% said yes. Only 24% said no. Those numbers are obviously much higher than they were before this incident. How concerned should the American people be about having to give up some liberties to deal with terrorism?
I think the very reason why we have to do whatever is necessary to eliminate these organizations and punish the countries that are involved as well. And that's why I think the President's statement was very important about countries that harbor these people as well as the organizations themselves. But what we have to do is make sure that there's a steadfastness of purpose, and thereby we can preserve America's liberties. Yes, there will be lifestyle changes. We'll never be the same getting on an airliner again, and there will be other security measures that need to be taken. But the best way to ensure maximum liberty for the United States of America is to remove the threat to it, because this whole threat obviously was about destroying our way of life.
And as you know, Senator McCain, some of your colleagues are proposing that Congress pass an act, a declaration of war, a formal declaration of war, against whom I'm not exactly sure, but is that a good idea?
I think in theory it's not a bad idea, because I think the more steadfast and the strongest message we send is good. But as you just said, I'm not exactly sure who we declare war on. I think we could achieve the goals of making sure that the world and the American people know of our steadfastness and our seriousness, perhaps by some other kind of declaration. I just don't know exactly how mechanically it would work to declare war, because, as you said, who would it be on?
Senator, what do you make of the fact that our NATO allies have unanimously sort of joined in support of the United States? What does that mean sort of in the big picture that NATO has at least made this statement so quickly?
I think it's great credit to the President and Secretary Powell and others that have made this happen so quickly. I think it's a significant step. I think now we will recruit our Asian allies and other allies throughout the world to make basically the same pledge. I think the President is doing what his father did in 1991 at the time of the Persian Gulf War, and I think they deserve credit for what's been done in a very short period of time.
So as a practical matter, Senator, what do you expect in the next few days with all this sort of world support for the United States and at least a tremendous amount of, of anger in this country?
Well, I think we have to control the anger, for one thing. We don't want to retaliate against any American or anyone who is of Arab descent. That's not what America's all about. So we have to focus on our anger on those that deserve it, and that is these organizations and these countries. We have to continue to tell the American people that there's not going to be a quick fix. We have to continue to build alliances and partners and coalitions so that we can act in a concerted fashion. Every nation in the world is in danger if the United States is in danger. And then I think we formulate our plans to respond militarily, not ruling out any option. And so far, I think we're proceeding well, but we've got a long way to go. And of course, all of our American hearts are heavy.
Senator McCain, when President Bush says he will make no distinction between those responsible, the terrorists responsible for these actions, and those who harbor them or support them, give them some sort of protection, what does that say to you?
It says to me he's right on the mark, because these terrorist organizations would find it impossible to carry out the sophistication, the training, the operational capabilities that they have attained if they didn't have a country that would give them sanctuary and sometimes assistance. So this is an integral part of this challenge that we face, and I was very pleased to hear the President make that statement, because I think it's very important.
On a personal level, Senator, how difficult or hard is it on members of the United States Senate and the House of Representatives in a situation like this when the American people at least feel so unprotected?
I think it gives us a sense of responsibility to communicate with the people and our constituents and do what we can to assure them that this, the greatest nation in the world, will remain so, and we'll do everything we can to protect them. But I also think that as your conversation with Jeff Greenfield, we've been a very fortunate nation. We've been protected by two oceans, and now we live in an era where all of those protections are not as valuable as they were in the past. And we still live in a very dangerous world, which is a reason why the United States of America must maintain its military preparedness.
And of course, Senator, you know, we also value our freedoms. That's why so many people want to come to this country. How do we have that balance in the future, the fear versus the freedoms that we've enjoyed so much?
First of all, we have to destroy the threat to those freedoms, and then second of all, we have to do everything in our power to protect those freedoms. Yes, there may be some changes. Maybe there's, as I said, the airline business. Perhaps their borders have to be more carefully policed. There may have to be some changes, but we must be dedicated to the proposition of preserving the freedom of the American people. Otherwise, the terrorists have won, and we can't allow that.
Is there any way, though, to reconcile the changes that are obviously going to unfold in the day-to-day lives of Americans with the need to signal to the terrorists that they're not going to win, that our lives are not going to change?
Yes, well, because I think there's a real difference between perhaps waiting a half an hour to get on an airplane instead of walking on board, and really the curtailment of the fundamental freedoms of democracy, freedom of movement, freedom of speech, freedoms, all of those freedoms that are the vital parts of democracy. And yes, we may have to have changes in lifestyle, but I don't think, in fact, it is our commitment. It's our solemn promise that we will preserve the liberties that made this nation so great and are exactly the reason why they want to attack us and destroy us.
Senator McCain, we only have a couple seconds left,
Sure.
but can Americans stand down right now and assume that this terror operation is over with and we can go back to our day-to-day lives?
I don't know. I assume so. But we have to be vigilant and we have to be prepared, and the sooner we eradicate this threat to our nation, the more we can have a permanent sense of security, the more likely it is.
Senator John McCain, always good to speak with you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Wolf.
Thank you. And let's recap once again some of the latest information we have as of this minute. Search and rescue crews have evacuated the World Trade Center site after the partial collapse of another nearby building. It's One Liberty Plaza, a 54-story tower whose tenants include NASDAQ. Investigators believe they've identified some of the hijackers. Part of the probe is focusing on Florida, where several people are being questioned. Several homes were searched. New details of possible efforts to save the plane that crashed in Pennsylvania. At least 2 of the passengers were able to call relatives. One passenger told his wife the men on board had voted to try to overtake the hijackers. And members of Congress held a vigil tonight on Capitol Hill. Tomorrow they're expected to approve $20 billion for the recovery and the investigation. Greta, I know you've been covering a lot of these kinds of investigations, nothing obviously as huge as this. They always say the first hours after an event like this are the most critical in collecting so-called forensic evidence that could hold up in a court of law. Is it your sense that these hours are slipping away, or are they doing the job they can do?
I don't think so, Wolf. I mean, this is a very different investigation. I don't think right now the American people or our president is necessarily looking to prosecute. I think that they have a different sort of agenda, especially when we hear words like war being thrown around in terms of, I think the government has a very different approach. They're not seeking to bring them into the courtroom, but to do something very different. Having said that, in this case, we know who was on the planes because they're the manifest, the passenger list. The more difficult problem is those who assisted or aided, anybody who sort of gave the nod, maybe a security person who might have looked the other way as they slid in with the knife. Those are the more difficult people to identify. And I don't think that it's necessary, that we're going to get those people, but those people who helped are just as involved in the conspiracy to kill all these people and are just as responsible. They're the hard people to catch, and I don't think time makes a big difference.
Is it your sense, Greta, that if the U.S. government holds up some very, very stringent legal requirement, legal condition for pursuing those who may be responsible, the U.S. may wind up doing nothing?
I don't think the U.S. is going to do nothing. I mean, listening to Senator Shelby, Senator McCain, the President of the United States, I think the American government is going to do something. I don't know what it is, but I also think if given the opportunity to bring people into court, I think they will do that. And in 1996, a statute was passed, an anti-terrorism statute, in which if you are convicted under that statute, you are eligible for the death penalty. You'll be tried in federal court, and you will be eligible for the death penalty. And I suspect, with the magnitude of the destruction and tragedy, that you'll get the full force of the government against you.
And the reason that Ramzi Youssef, the mastermind of the first World Trade Center bombing, is serving a life sentence plus 200 years, didn't get the death penalty is what?
I don't know. It's because the jurors decided apparently not to give them the death penalty. I don't jump in the minds of the jurors, but the one thing is that, as I looked around Washington tonight, Wolf, I got to say that the city is very quiet tonight after the tragedy at the Pentagon here, but we are now facing the police presence in this city, and things may change a lot for us, at least in the short run. Wolf?
All right, Greta, and that wraps up our coverage for this special hour, but stay tuned. Larry King Live is up next here on CNN.
Larry will be talking to witnesses, aviation safety experts, terrorism experts, and lawmakers on the day after the attack on America. Good night, Wolf.
Good night, Greta. And right after Larry King, there will be a special one-hour CNN report, America Under Attack, hosted by CNN's Aaron Brown and Paul Lazano. Good night.